Hey there, history lovers. Tonight we're chasing a man who, at just 22, sailed across the sea, hurled a spear into enemy soil and declared the entire continent of Asia his. No backup plan, just a kid with a spear and an ego the size of 3 kingdoms. His name was Alexander, king of a tiny, scrappy nation called Macedonia. Here's the part that breaks people's brains. In 10 years of non-stop war, he never lost a single battle. Not one. He marched from Greece all the way to Pakistan, faced down war elephants, crushed armies double and triple his size, then died at 32 still undefeated. Most of us at 32 are just proud we remembered to water a plant. So tonight we follow the whole wild ride, from the boy who tamed a horse nobody else could ride to the ruler of half the world. But first, hit that like button if you love this kind of deep dive, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. What city, what time is it right now? Let's roll. So let's rewind the tape all the way back to the beginning, because legends like this one don't just fall out of the sky fully formed with a sword in one hand and a map of Asia in the other. Before Alexander was the man who terrified emperors, he was a baby born in the summer of 356 BC in a city called Pella, the capital of Macedonia. And here is the first thing worth understanding, because it reframes the entire story. To the polished, self-important Greeks of Athens and Corinth, Macedonia was the sticks. It was the rough northern frontier, a land of horse breeders, hard drinkers, and mountain clans who, in the opinion of the cultured South, barely spoke proper Greek and could not be trusted to behave at a dinner party. The fancy city-states looked down their noses at Macedonia, the way a big city food critic might look at a roadside diner. Naturally, this little roadside diner would go on to swallow the entire region whole, but nobody saw that coming yet. Alexander's father was a man named Philip, the second king to carry that name, and Philip was not a gentle soul. He was a battle-scarred soldier who had spent his youth as a hostage in a foreign city, which in those days was a perfectly normal way to spend your teenage years, and he came out of that experience with a head full of military ideas and an iron will to drag Macedonia out of the mud. By the time his famous son was born, Philip had already lost an eye to an arrow during a siege, walked with a limp from old wounds, and turned his backwater kingdom into a war machine that the snooty southern Greeks were starting to find very alarming indeed. He was, by all accounts, a charming and ruthless drunk who could negotiate a treaty in the morning and break it by dinner, which made him exhausting to fight and impossible to trust. As role models for a young conqueror go, you could do worse, though probably not much better. Alexander's mother, on the other hand, was a force of nature wrapped in a thunderstorm. Her name was Olympias, a princess from the kingdom of Epirus, and she was as fiercely ambitious as her husband, possibly more so, with a streak of religious intensity that unsettled everyone around her. She was deeply devoted to ecstatic mystery cults, and ancient writers loved to tell stories about how she kept large tame snakes that she would handle during religious ceremonies, which, unsurprisingly, did not do much to calm her husband's nerves. There is a famous tale that the night before Alexander was conceived, Olympias dreamed her body was struck by a thunderbolt, and that Philip dreamed he sealed her womb with the image of a lion. You can read these as genuine omens, or as the ancient equivalent of a celebrity origin story carefully polished after the fact, but either way they tell you how people remembered this family. Nothing about Alexander's household was ever going to be ordinary. The marriage between Philip and Olympias was less a loving partnership, and more a long-running Cold War with occasional outbreaks of open hostility, and young Alexander grew up squarely in the middle of it, learning very early that the people closest to you were also the people most likely to be plotting something. From his mother, the boy absorbed a sense of destiny, and a conviction that he was meant for something enormous. Olympias seems to have spent a good deal of energy convincing her son that he was descended from gods and heroes, that his bloodline ran back to Achilles on her side, and to the mighty Heracles on his father's, and that ordinary rules simply did not apply to him. This is the kind of parenting advice that produces either a world conqueror or an absolute menace at a family reunion, and in Alexander's case it arguably produced both. From his father, meanwhile, he learned the practical business of war, government, and survival, in a court where smiling allies kept knives under their cloaks. The combination was potent. He had his mother's belief that he was special, and his father's understanding of exactly how to make the rest of the world agree. There is one story from his childhood that captures the boy better than any list of his ancestors, and it involves a horse. According to the tale, a horse dealer brought a magnificent black stallion named Bucephalus to Philip's court, asking an outrageous sum for the animal. The horse was beautiful but completely unmanageable. Every experienced rider Philip put on him was promptly thrown off, and the king was about to send the beast away in disgust when his young son, by some accounts only around 12 years old, piped up and complained that the grown men were ruining a perfectly good horse out of sheer clumsiness. This is, for the record, exactly the sort of thing that makes a father want to teach his child a humbling lesson. Philip, half amused and half annoyed, told the boy that if he was so clever he could try to tame the animal himself, and if he failed, he would pay the price for his big mouth. Now, most 12-year-olds in that situation would have quietly reconsidered their life choices. Alexander instead walked up to the horse and did something none of the seasoned riders had bothered to do. He had noticed that the stallion was spooked by its own shadow shifting on the ground, so he calmly turned the animal to face directly into the sun, where the frightening shadow vanished behind it. He spoke softly, stroked the horse to settle it, and then sprang onto its back and rode it cleanly across the field, while the entire court stood there with their jaws somewhere around their knees. The story goes that Philip, watching his son ride back in triumph, had tears in his eyes and told the boy that Macedonia was too small for him and that he should go and find a kingdom worthy of his ambitions. It is a perfect anecdote, almost suspiciously perfect, but the detail that matters is the one about the shadow. Alexander did not beat the horse into submission. He figured out what was actually frightening it and removed the problem. That habit of looking past the obvious, of finding the hidden flaw that everyone else missed, would later win him battles against armies several times his size. Bucephalus, by the way, became his lifelong companion and carried him across thousands of miles of campaigning, which is not a bad return on a horse everyone else had written off as a lost cause. A boy with that kind of promise needed a serious education, and Philip did not skimp. He recruited none other than Aristotle, already one of the most respected thinkers in the Greek world, to tutor his teenage son. The two of them, along with a small group of young noble companions who would later become Alexander's generals and closest friends, withdrew to a quiet retreat at a place called Mysa, where for several years the philosopher taught the prince philosophy, politics, ethics, biology, and medicine. It was, in effect, the most exclusive private school in history, with a student body of about a dozen future warlords and a faculty consisting of the single greatest mind of the age. Whether the lessons fully took is a fair question, given how the curriculum on moderation and self-restraint would play out over the next 2 decades, but the education left its mark in other ways. Alexander developed a genuine curiosity about the natural world, sending plant and animal specimens back to his old teacher even during his campaigns, which is a thoughtful gesture from a man who was usually busy conquering things. Above all else, Aristotle gave him the Iliad, the great poem of the Trojan War, and Alexander absolutely fell in love with it. He came to see the warrior Achilles not as a character in an old story, but as a personal hero and a model to imitate, the gold standard of glory that every action should be measured against. He reportedly slept with a copy of the poem under his pillow, alongside a dagger, which is a fairly accurate summary of his entire personality in 2 objects. Throughout his later life he carried that text with him everywhere, treating it less like a book and more like a roadmap to immortality. To Alexander, the message of the poem was clear. A short life crowded with everlasting fame was infinitely better than a long, comfortable, forgettable one. Most people grow out of that idea around their mid-20s. Alexander built an empire out of it. It is worth pausing here on the small group of young men who studied alongside him at Mysa, because they were no ordinary classmates. They were the sons of Macedonia's leading noble families, raised together with the prince in a system designed to bind the kingdom's future leaders to the crown from boyhood. Boys of the aristocracy served as royal pages at court, attending the king, guarding him as he slept, and learning the brutal trade of war and politics by watching it up close. Friendships forged in that hothouse environment ran deep, and several of these companions, including a quiet, loyal young man named Hephaestion, who would become the closest friend of Alexander's entire life, would later command his armies and govern his provinces. It was, in effect, a leadership academy that doubled as a band of brothers, and it gave Alexander something most conquerors never have: a core of talented men who had known him since childhood and would follow him to the literal ends of the earth. Of course, the same closeness that produced lifelong devotion would later produce paranoia and tragedy when some of those boyhood bonds curdled, but that lay far in the future. For now they were simply young men being trained, alongside their remarkable friend, to inherit a kingdom. He did not have a long childhood, in any case. because in Macedonia you grew up fast or you did not grow up at all. When Alexander was only 16, his father marched off on campaign and left the teenager in charge of the entire kingdom as regent. Most 16-year-olds are not trusted with anything more dangerous than the family chariot, but Alexander immediately got his chance to prove himself. A local tribe to the north rose up in revolt while Philip was away, and rather than wait nervously for his father to come home and sort it out, the young regent gathered an army, marched out, and crushed the rebellion himself. To drive the point home, he expelled the troublemakers, settled the area with a mix of new colonists, and renamed the place after himself, calling it Alexandropolis. He was 16. He had founded a city named after himself before he was old enough to be considered a full adult. If you ever needed a single fact to predict the rest of his career, that is the one. Founding cities named Alexandria would go on to become one of his most enthusiastic hobbies, and this was simply the first entry in a very long list. 2 years later came the moment that announced him to the wider Greek world. In 338 BC, Philip finally brought the major southern city-states to a decisive battle near a town called Cheronea. The opposing alliance, led mainly by Athens and Thebes, fielded a formidable army, and at the heart of the Theban line stood the most respected fighting unit in all of Greece, an elite corps of 300 hand-picked warriors known as the Sacred Band. This unit had a fearsome reputation and had not been beaten in open battle for a generation. Philip, the wily old strategist, gave his 18-year-old son command of the cavalry on one wing, which was either a tremendous show of confidence or a calculated way to test whether the boy would survive contact with a real enemy. Possibly both. The battle unfolded according to a clever plan. Philip ordered part of his line to feign a retreat, pulling back in apparent disorder, and the eager Athenian troops opposite them broke ranks to chase the seemingly fleeing Macedonians, exactly as Philip had hoped. The advancing enemy line stretched thin and opened a gap, and that gap was precisely what Alexander had been waiting for. He led his cavalry in a thundering charge straight into the opening, slamming into the side and rear of the enemy formation before they understood what was happening. The Sacred Band, true to their reputation, refused to flee. They held their ground and fought where they stood until they were almost entirely wiped out. It was a brutal end for a famous unit, and the story goes that when Philip later walked the battlefield and saw them fallen in their ranks, even that hardened old campaigner was moved by their courage. The victory at Cheronea effectively ended the independence of the old Greek city-states and made Philip the master of Greece, and it was the teenage Alexander who had delivered the killing blow. By this point, 3 traits had locked firmly into place, and they would define everything that followed. The first was his education, that rare combination of a sharp, curious mind trained by the best teacher available, which let him think his way around problems that defeated lesser commanders. The second was his absolute fearlessness, a willingness to put his own body in the most dangerous spot on any battlefield, which inspired devotion in his soldiers and very nearly got him killed on numerous occasions. And the third, the one that drove the other two, was a bottomless, almost feverish hunger to be first at everything, to be the best, to outdo not only his rivals but his own father and even the heroes of legend. This last trait was both his engine and eventually his undoing. A man who cannot bear to come in second place will conquer the world, but he will also never know when to stop, and he will be a nightmare to anyone unlucky enough to be standing nearby when he loses his temper. All of that was already there in the 18-year-old prince. The world simply had not met him properly yet. Before any of that, though, the family came perilously close to tearing itself apart, and the trouble started, as it so often did in royal households, at a wedding. Philip, never a man content with one marriage when several were available, decided to take a new young wife, a Macedonian noblewoman, which on its own would have been merely irritating to Olympias. What made it genuinely dangerous was that this new bride came from a powerful Macedonian family, which raised the unsettling possibility of a fully Macedonian heir who might one day be preferred over Alexander, whose mother was, after all, a foreign princess from Epirus. At the wedding feast, the bride's uncle, a senior noble named Attalus, stood up after a few too many cups of wine and offered a toast, hoping the union would produce a legitimate, true-born heir to the throne. The insult was unmistakable, since it implied that Alexander himself was somehow not a proper Macedonian. Alexander, never one to let a slight slide, hurled his cup at the man and demanded to know what that made him. Things escalated quickly, as things do at weddings where the guest of honour and the crown prince are throwing drinkware. Philip, drunk and enraged, lurched to his feet, drew his sword and started toward his own son, only to trip and collapse before he reached him. Alexander, watching his limping father sprawl across the floor, could not resist a parting shot, mocking that here was a man who planned to cross from one continent to another, but could not even make it across a dining room. It was a vicious line, and a memorable one, and it more or less ended their relationship for the time being. In the aftermath of this spectacular family blow-up, Alexander took his mother and stormed off into exile, fleeing first to her homeland in Epirus, before drifting on to the lands of the northern tribes. For a period, the heir to Macedonia was estranged from the king and far from court, which was an extremely dangerous place for an ambitious young prince to be, since absence from the centre of power was exactly how a man got quietly forgotten or replaced. Eventually a mutual friend smoothed things over and brought Alexander back, but the wound never fully healed, and the suspicion lingered on both sides. The whole episode mattered enormously for what came later, because it meant that when Philip was suddenly killed, there were already plenty of people prepared to believe that Alexander, or his formidable mother, might have had a personal motive far beyond simple impatience for the throne. The tension flared up again in an episode that showed Alexander at his most insecure and impulsive. A foreign ruler in Asia Minor offered a marriage alliance, proposing to wed his daughter to one of Philip's sons. Alexander, fearing he was being sidelined and that his half-brother might be groomed as an alternative heir, secretly tried to insert himself as the groom instead, sending his own agent to arrange the match behind his father's back. When Philip found out, he was livid, not least because his son had clumsily meddled in a delicate diplomatic affair and made the family look ridiculous. The king cancelled the whole arrangement, scolded his son for aiming so low, and banished several of Alexander's closest friends as punishment for encouraging him. It was not Alexander's finest hour. The future conqueror of the world had, in effect, tried to elope by messenger and gotten caught. But it revealed how deeply he feared being passed over, and how that fear could push him into rash decisions. Then, with relations between father and son still frosty, the assassination changed everything in a single afternoon. That introduction to the wider world would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would come the way these things often did in Macedonia, through a sudden death at the worst possible moment. In the year 336 BC, Philip was at the height of his power. He had unified Greece under his leadership, built the finest army in the known world, and was now preparing the grand project that would crown his entire career, a massive invasion of the Persian Empire to the east. He had even sent an advance force across into Asia to prepare the ground. The plan was set, the army was ready, and to celebrate this golden moment, Philip arranged a lavish wedding festival in the old royal capital at Aegae, marrying off one of his daughters in front of an audience of dignitaries gathered from across Greece and beyond. It was meant to be a triumphant display of Macedonian power and unity, the moment when Philip stood before the world as the man about to conquer the greatest empire on earth. It did not go as planned. As Philip walked into the theatre at the heart of the celebrations, deliberately appearing without his bodyguards in a show of confidence meant to impress his guests, one of his own bodyguards, a man named Pausanias, stepped forward and struck him down. The assassin then bolted for the city gates where horses were waiting, but he tripped on a vine while fleeing and was caught and killed by the king's guards before he could be questioned. And that, conveniently or inconveniently depending on how you look at it, is where the certainty ends. The personal grievance behind the killing was real enough, rooted in a bitter dispute Pausanias had with powerful men at court that the king had failed to resolve to his satisfaction. But almost immediately fingers began pointing in several directions at once, because Philip was a man with a long list of people who might have benefited from his sudden absence. Some whispered that the fiercely ambitious Olympias had a hand in it, furious as she was at having been pushed aside in favour of a younger wife. Others quietly wondered about Alexander himself, who had every reason to want the throne sooner rather than later. There was even a theory pointing at the Persians, who certainly had no desire to see Philip's invasion succeed. The truth was buried with the assassin on the day he died, and historians have been arguing about it ever since. What is not in dispute is who walked away the winner. Alexander was 20 years old when his father was killed, and he wasted absolutely no time. Within days he had the support of the army and the leading nobles, and he moved to secure the throne with the kind of cold efficiency you would expect from someone raised in this particular family. The brutal reality of royal succession in that world was that a new king could not afford to leave rival claimants alive, because a living rival was simply a rebellion waiting for the right moment. So Alexander, with the methodical calm of a man clearing weeds before they could take root, eliminated the figures at court who posed a threat to his rule, including potential challengers from rival branches of the royal house and the powerful relatives of his father's last wife. It was not pretty, and it was not kind, but by the standards of the time it was simply how the game was played. The alternative was to spend his reign looking over his shoulder, and Alexander had no intention of spending his reign doing anything except moving forward. While he was busy securing his power at home, the rest of his father's hard-won empire took one look at the 20-year-old new king and decided this was the perfect opportunity to break free. After all, in the eyes of the various subject peoples and unhappy allies, the formidable Philip was dead, and his throne had been inherited by a boy barely out of his teens. How hard could it be to throw off Macedonian rule now? This turned out to be one of the more spectacular miscalculations in ancient history. In a field with stiff competition, revolts and unrest flared up across the map almost simultaneously, among the tribes to the north in Thrace and Illyria, among the Greeks of Thessaly, and among the proud southern city-states who had never enjoyed bowing to Macedonia in the first place. Alexander's response was a masterclass in not giving your enemies time to think. Rather than dealing with the threats one at a time at a measured pace, he moved with a speed that left everyone reeling. When the Thessalians blocked a mountain pass to stop his army from marching south, he simply had his men cut steps into the side of the mountain and went around them overnight, appearing on the other side before they had finished congratulating themselves. The stunned Thessalians promptly surrendered and elected him their leader, which is a polite way of saying they decided they would rather be on his side than in his path. He then swept south, reminded the rest of Greece who was in charge, and turned to deal with the troublesome northern tribes who thought the mountains and rivers would protect them. They were wrong, and the northern campaign produced some of the cleverest improvising of his early career. He marched all the way to the great river in the north, the mighty Danube, intending to scatter a hostile tribe that had gathered on the far bank, feeling very safe behind all that water. Alexander had no fleet, and no bridge, which would have stopped most commanders cold. Instead, in the dead of night, he had his soldiers stuff their leather tent covers with hay so they floated like rafts, gathered up every small boat and dugout canoe in the area, and ferried a strike force across the river under cover of darkness, marching them through a tall field of standing grain by pushing the stalks flat with their spears as they advanced. The tribesmen on the far bank woke up to discover a Macedonian army that had no business being there standing in their fields, and they scattered in understandable panic. It was the sort of stunt that worked precisely because it was supposed to be impossible, and Alexander had a lifelong fondness for doing the thing that nobody believed could be done. He was just as resourceful when an alliance of Illyrian tribes to the west trapped his army in a difficult valley, surrounding the Macedonians on the high ground and leaving them apparently doomed. Rather than panic, Alexander put on a display of parade ground drill so precise and so eerily silent that the watching tribesmen, more used to chaotic warfare, were unnerved into hesitating, and he used that confusion to extract his army across a river and then turn around and crush his overconfident pursuers with a surprise night attack. The whole northern adventure demonstrated, in case anyone still doubted it, that there was nowhere far enough away to escape him, no river wide enough and no mountain high enough. The campaign was fast, decisive, and exactly the kind of statement a young king needed to make. But while Alexander was off in the wild north stamping out rebellions, a far more dangerous rumour began to spread through the Greek cities to the south. Word arrived that the young king had been killed in battle against the northern tribes. The rumour was completely false, but it landed like a spark in dry grass. The city of Thebes, which had bitterly resented Macedonian control ever since Chaeronea, seized on the news and rose up in open revolt, attacking the Macedonian garrison stationed there and rallying others to join them in throwing off the hated occupation. They were absolutely certain that the boy king was dead and that their moment of freedom had finally come. He was, of course, very much alive, and he was furious. Covering an enormous distance in a matter of days, Alexander appeared before the walls of Thebes with his army, while the rebels were still celebrating their supposed liberation, which must have been an extremely awkward surprise. He gave the city a chance to back down peacefully, but the Thebans, perhaps too far committed to retreat, chose to fight. What followed was meant as a lesson for all of Greece, and it was a terrible one. The ancient and storied city of Thebes, one of the oldest and most famous in the Greek world, was captured and almost completely destroyed. Its surviving inhabitants were sold into slavery, and the city itself was largely torn down on Alexander's orders. According to tradition, he spared the temples of the gods, as well as the house that had once belonged to the great poet Pindar, a gesture that tells you something about how seriously he took the worlds of religion and poetry, even in the middle of an act of devastating punishment. He could erase an entire city from the map, but he would not lay a hand on the home of a poet he admired. The man contained multitudes, most of them alarming. The message, delivered in the bluntest possible terms, was received loud and clear across the entire Greek world. If you rose up against Alexander, you would not simply be defeated. You would be made into an example so severe that future generations would think twice before even whispering about rebellion. Athens, which had been quietly cheering on the Theban revolt and preparing to join in, suddenly discovered an urgent enthusiasm for peace and sent ambassadors to grovel for forgiveness. Alexander, who needed Athens and its powerful fleet for his coming campaign and had no interest in destroying it, accepted their apology with surprising leniency. He understood the difference between a lesson that needed to be taught and a useful asset that should not be smashed for the sake of it, which was a level of strategic patience his temper did not always allow him. With Greece thoroughly cowed, Alexander turned to formalizing his position. He gathered representatives from the Greek states at the city of Corinth and had himself confirmed as the supreme leader of an alliance his father had originally created, the league that bound the Greek states together under Macedonian command. More importantly, this alliance granted him the official authority to lead a unified Greek war against the Persian Empire, framed not as a Macedonian conquest, but as a grand campaign of vengeance and liberation on behalf of all Greeks, payback for old Persian invasions of Greece generations earlier. It was a brilliant piece of branding. Alexander was not merely a young king grabbing land. He was now the official champion of the entire Greek world, marching east to settle an ancient score. Whether the ordinary Greeks fully believed this or simply went along with it because the alternative was unpleasant is another matter, but the title was his, and it gave his ambitions a respectable banner to march under. There was one notable holdout in all of this. The city of Sparta, famously proud and famously stubborn, refused to join the alliance, declaring that it was not their tradition to follow others into battle, but only to lead. It was a defiant gesture from a city living largely on its faded reputation, and Alexander, in a rare display of restraint, mostly chose to ignore them rather than waste energy on a fight that would gain him little. Sometimes the most powerful response to a defiant gesture is to simply pretend you did not notice it, and Alexander had bigger fish to fry. It was around this time, with all of Greece either kneeling or carefully looking the other way, that one of the most memorable encounters of his early career supposedly took place, and it is worth telling because it captures something the battles do not. While Alexander was at Corinth receiving the congratulations of important men eager to flatter the new master of Greece, he went out of his way to visit a famous philosopher named Diogenes, a man notorious for living in extreme simplicity and for caring absolutely nothing about wealth, status, or the opinions of powerful people. Diogenes was, in modern terms, the original man who lived in a barrel and told everyone exactly what he thought of them. When the most powerful young man in the Greek world approached him and grandly offered to grant him anything he desired, the philosopher, who was lying in the sun at the time, reportedly asked only that Alexander step aside a little, because he was blocking the sunlight. The crowd of attendants was scandalized at this lack of respect. Alexander, however, was deeply impressed rather than offended, and is said to have remarked that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes. It is a small story, but it reveals a man who genuinely admired the one person in Greece, completely unmoved by his power, even as he was about to set out to conquer the world precisely because he could not imagine being unmoved by anything. And so the stage was finally set. In the space of a couple of short years, a 20-year-old who had inherited a kingdom in chaos had eliminated his rivals, crushed every rebellion thrown at him, terrified Greece into submission, and gathered the full authority and resources of the Greek world behind a single overwhelming purpose. The brilliant, dangerous father had laid the foundations and assembled the army, but he had not lived to use it. Now that army, that plan, and that ambition all belonged to the son, who had every intention of finishing what Philip had only dreamed of starting. The vast and ancient Persian Empire, the wealthiest and most powerful realm on earth, lay waiting just across the water, ruled by a king who had no idea that the greatest threat of his life was a young man barely old enough to have proven anything beyond his own homeland. Everything Alexander had been raised to be, every lesson from his mother about destiny, and every lesson from his father about war, was about to be tested against the largest empire the world had ever known. The boy who tamed a horse by understanding its fear was about to find out whether the same trick worked on an entire civilization. To understand how that trick worked on an entire civilization, you first have to understand the instrument he was about to use, because the army Alexander inherited was not just a big crowd of angry men with sharp objects. It was the most advanced fighting machine of its age, a finely tuned system in which every part had a job and every part depended on the others. This matters enormously, because the central puzzle of the whole story is this. Alexander repeatedly marched into battle with somewhere around 40,000 men and walked out victorious against enemy forces that were 2 or 3 times larger and sometimes more. That does not happen by accident, and it certainly does not happen through sheer bravery alone, no matter how many heroic poems say otherwise. It happens because one side has figured out how to fight, and the other side, for all its numbers, has not. The heart of this machine was a formation that his father had perfected, and that the Greeks found genuinely terrifying, the Macedonian phalanx. Picture a dense block of around 9,000 infantrymen, packed shoulder to shoulder, 16 ranks deep. Now give each of those men a pike called a sarissa, a monstrous spear roughly 18 feet long, which is about the length of a small bus, and a deeply impractical thing to carry to a dinner party. The weapon was so long and so heavy that it required both hands to wield, which meant these soldiers could only manage a small shield strapped to the forearm and slung around the neck rather than the big shields ordinary Greek infantry carried. When the formation lowered its pikes for battle, the points of the first several ranks all projected out beyond the front line at once, creating a bristling, layered wall of metal points that no enemy could push through, and very few were brave enough to even approach. Charging this thing head-on was, to put it gently, a poor career decision. It looked less like a body of men, and more like an enormous steel porcupine that had decided to walk in your direction. What made it work was not just the hardware, but the years of relentless drill behind it. Moving a block of 9,000 men carrying 18-foot pikes, without the whole thing collapsing into a tangle of poles and bruised heads, required constant practice, and these soldiers trained until the maneuvers were second nature. The ranks too far back to reach the enemy with their pikes did not simply stand idle either. They angled their long sarissas upward at a slant, forming a kind of protective thicket overhead that could deflect incoming arrows and javelins before they fell on the men below, which was a thoughtful arrangement given how unpleasant it is to be rained on by archers. The result was a formation that was not only deadly at the front but surprisingly well shielded on top, a slow and ponderous fortress of timber and iron that simply walked forward and dared anyone to test it. The phalanx had one crucial limitation though, and the entire art of Alexander's warfare flowed from understanding it. That wall of pikes was nearly unstoppable from the front, but slow, clumsy, and dangerously exposed on its flanks and rear. The men were so committed to holding their long pikes forward that they could not easily turn to face a threat from the side, and on broken or uneven ground the tight formation could come apart, opening gaps that an enemy could exploit. So the phalanx, despite being the most famous part of the army, was never actually meant to be the part that won the battle. It was the anvil. Its job was to lock the enemy in place at the front, to pin them down and hold their attention, while the real killing blow came from somewhere else entirely. Most of Alexander's opponents made the understandable mistake of focusing all their fear on the terrifying pikes, which was precisely what he wanted them to do. Guarding the vulnerable seam where that pike wall ended stood an elite force of around 3,000 infantry known as the hypaspists, which translates roughly as shield-bearers, commanded by a capable officer named Nicanor. These were the most physically fit and tactically flexible foot soldiers in the army, lighter and faster than the pike block, and they served as the vital hinge connecting the slow-moving phalanx to the fast-moving cavalry. When the line advanced at an angle, as it often did, it was the hypaspists who kept the formation from tearing apart at that dangerous junction. They were the elite athletes of the infantry, the unit you sent when something needed doing quickly and well, and Alexander relied on them constantly for the jobs the lumbering phalanx simply could not perform. Behind and around this corps stood the supporting cast. There were Greek allied infantry and hired mercenary soldiers fighting in the older, heavier style, who often held the second line or guarded the camp and the baggage. These men were useful, but Alexander never entirely trusted the hired Greeks, partly because mercenaries fight for whoever pays best, and partly because plenty of Greeks were fighting on the Persian side for exactly that reason. Then there were the light troops, who never get the glory but won an astonishing share of the battles. His personal favourites were the Agrianians, fierce javelin throwers from the northern mountains who functioned as his special forces, equally deadly in a pitched battle, a surprise night raid, or a brutal mountain climb where heavy infantry would have been useless. Alongside them ran Thracian skirmishers, slingers, and skilled archers, including expert bowmen from Crete. These were the men who scouted ahead, screened the army on the march, picked off enemy skirmishers, and handled the dirty, unglamorous work that kept the whole expedition alive. They were, in modern terms, the difference between an army and a parade. And then there was the fist. The decisive striking weapon of the entire army was the heavy cavalry known as the companions, the hetairoi, around 1,800 superbly trained and superbly equipped horsemen drawn from the Macedonian nobility. These were not the lightly armed horse archers favoured elsewhere. They were shock cavalry, charging in a wedge-shaped formation with a point at the front, designed to punch through enemy lines like a spearhead and then fan out to cause maximum chaos. The overall command belonged to an officer named Philotas, but the man who actually led them into the charge, riding at the very tip of the wedge in the most dangerous position on the field, was the king himself. This was the engine of his fearlessness made tactical. Alexander did not simply tolerate danger, he weaponized it, placing himself at the exact spot where the battle would be decided, so that his men, seeing their king risk everything alongside them, would follow him into situations that should have been suicidal. On the opposite wing rode the excellent Thessalian cavalry, every bit the equal of the companions but generally assigned the steadier defensive role of holding the line while their king did something reckless on the other side of the field. It is worth appreciating just how difficult this kind of cavalry fighting actually was, because the modern image of armoured horsemen tends to come with conveniences these men did not have. There were no stirrups in this era, which means these riders charged into massed enemy formations and fought hand-to-hand while balancing on a galloping horse with nothing but their legs and a firm grip to keep them in the saddle. Their main weapon was a long, sturdy lance of tough wood, gripped in one hand and used to strike down at the enemy, and when it broke, as it frequently did, they drew swords and carried on. Charging in a tight wedge demanded extraordinary horsemanship and nerve from every rider, since a single man losing control could disrupt the entire formation at the worst possible moment. That these noblemen could maintain a disciplined wedge, punch it precisely into a gap in the enemy line, and then wheel and fight without being thrown from their mounts says a great deal about the skill bred into the Macedonian aristocracy from childhood. They had, after all, grown up on horseback, which in their part of the world was less a hobby than a birthright. Now put all those pieces together, and you get the tactic that conquered the known world, a method historians like to call the hammer and the anvil. The phalanx and the supporting infantry would advance and grind into the enemy front, fixing them in place, absorbing their attention, becoming the anvil against which everything else would be smashed. Meanwhile the king, watching the enemy line with the eye of a man who had once spotted a horse, afraid of its own shadow, would wait for the seam to open, the moment when the opposing formation stretched, shifted, or lost its shape under pressure. The instant the gap appeared, he would launch the companion cavalry, the hammer, driving the wedge straight into the weak point, rolling up the enemy from the side and the rear while they were still busy staring at the pikes in front of them. Caught between the immovable infantry and the irresistible cavalry, even a much larger army would shatter. It is elegant on paper, and it was devastating in practice, and the reason it kept working is that it required a level of coordination, timing, and discipline that Alexander's enemies simply could not match. But there is a less glamorous secret to his success that gets far less attention than the cavalry charges, and it is this. Alexander won his wars in the supply lines just as much as on the battlefield. His father had transformed the army by ruthlessly cutting down the enormous baggage trains that traditionally slowed armies to a crawl, where other forces dragged along huge convoys of ox carts, servants, and assorted hangers-on. The Macedonians were stripped down for speed, with soldiers carrying much of their own gear and equipment, pack animals replacing wheeled wagons wherever possible, and an obsessive attention to where the next meal and the next drink of water would come from. This is why Alexander could appear hundreds of miles from where his enemies expected him, often before they had even finished planning their response. An army that does not have to wait for its wagons can do impossible things, and a general who knows exactly how far his men can march on the food they're carrying can make promises that look like magic to everyone else. It is not the kind of detail that inspires epic poetry, but no amount of battlefield brilliance survives contact with an empty stomach, and Alexander understood that better than almost any commander before him. Holding all of this together, especially in the early years, was a man whose contribution is easy to overlook because he was the opposite of flashy. His name was Parmenion, and he was the seasoned, grey-haired veteran who had served Alexander's father loyally for decades, and now served the son as his most senior general. Parmenion was the steady hand, the experienced professional who commanded the defensive wing, while the young king galloped off to do something glorious and dangerous on the other side of the field. His role in battle was to hold firm, to absorb the enemy's pressure and refuse to break no matter how grim things looked, buying the time Alexander needed to land the decisive blow. He was also the voice of caution in the war council, the older man who would point out the risks and advise the sensible, prudent course of action, which the king then frequently ignored. The dynamic between them is one of the quiet tragedies of the whole story. The bold young genius and the careful old veteran, and for now it worked beautifully. Without Parmenion steadily holding the line, all of Alexander's dazzling cavalry charges would have been gambles that eventually came up empty. The brilliance needed the anchor. Remember that relationship because it does not end well, but in these opening years the two of them together were nearly unbeatable. Add to all this a corps of skilled engineers who could build siege towers and bridges seemingly out of thin air, surveyors who carefully measured and recorded the distances the army marched, a tight inner circle of talented officers who had grown up alongside the king, and a leader who shared his soldiers' hardships, ate what they ate, and led from the front, and you have the explanation for the great puzzle. The army was not large. It was simply better at being an army than anyone it would face for the next decade. With that machine assembled, oiled, and pointed east, it was finally time to use it. In the spring of the year 334 BC, Alexander gathered his forces and crossed the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, stepping onto the continent he intended to conquer. It is worth pausing to appreciate the sheer audacity of what he was attempting, because the empire he was invading was not some minor rival kingdom. It was the largest and richest state the world had ever seen, stretching from the edge of the Greek world all the way to the borders of distant India, home to countless peoples, fabulously wealthy cities, and a population that dwarfed anything in Greece. By any sensible measure, a small kingdom from the rough northern edge of the Greek world had no business even contemplating its conquest. Alexander, who had never been overly impressed by sensible measures, contemplated it anyway. The crossing itself was handled with the kind of theatrical care you would expect from a man who treated his own life as an unfolding epic. He sent the bulk of the army and the fleet across the strait under his generals, while he personally led a smaller force on a more meaningful route, pausing to perform elaborate sacrifices and ceremonies to the gods, including offerings to the sea god in the middle of the water to ensure safe passage. The famous gesture of hurling a spear into the Asian soil, claiming the entire continent as land won by the spear, belongs to this moment, and whether or not it happened exactly as the storytellers tell it, the spirit of it is perfectly accurate. He was the first man off the ships, leaping ashore in full armour, determined that the very first act of the campaign would be his own. He also took a detour to the site of the legendary city of Troy, where, in keeping with his lifelong obsession with the warrior Achilles, he made offerings at the hero's supposed tomb and took away an ancient sacred shield from a temple, which he then carried through the rest of his campaigns. The man was, in the most literal sense possible, trying to live inside his favourite story. Most fans of an old book are content to reread it. Alexander decided to reenact it across 2 continents with a real army. The Persian Empire, for its part, did not exactly mobilize its full might to meet this invasion, at least not at first. The great king himself, a ruler named Darius, the third of his name to hold the throne, was far away in the heart of his vast empire, and seems to have regarded this young Macedonian as a minor nuisance, rather than a genuine threat, which in fairness was a perfectly reasonable assessment based on everything that had ever happened before. Instead, the defence was left to the regional governors and noblemen of the western provinces, who gathered their forces to deal with the intruder before he could get comfortable. They assembled their army on the far bank of a river called the Granicus, and it was here that the war would have its first real test. Among the Persian commanders was the single most dangerous man Alexander would face in this entire phase of the war, and ironically he was not Persian at all. He was a Greek, a brilliant mercenary general named Memnon of Rhodes, who understood Alexander's army and its weaknesses far better than his Persian colleagues did. Memnon looked at the situation and gave them advice that was almost certainly correct, and that would almost certainly have changed history if anyone had listened to it. He argued that they should not fight Alexander in open battle at all. Instead, they should retreat, burn the crops, destroy the supplies, and lay waste to the land in front of the advancing Macedonians, starving the invasion to death without ever risking a pitched battle. As we have established, Alexander's entire war machine depended on being well fed and moving fast. Take away the food and the speed becomes a trap, the army melts away, and the whole glorious adventure ends quietly in a famine rather than spectacularly in a battle. It was, frankly, the move that would have worked. But the Persian noblemen would not hear of it, and their reasons were depressingly human. The land Memnon proposed to burn was their land. Those crops and estates and revenues belonged to them, and the idea of torching their own wealth and possessions to defeat some upstart foreigner struck them as both insulting and absurd. Why ruin your own property when you outnumber the enemy and can simply crush him in honest battle? Their pride and their bank accounts, working together as they so often do, overruled the one strategy that might have saved the empire decades of grief. They chose to fight, and they chose to fight on a river, which they imagined would protect them. They lined up their formidable cavalry along the top of the far bank, with their hired Greek infantry held in reserve behind, confident that the steep, muddy slopes and the water would break up any Macedonian attack. When Alexander arrived and surveyed the scene, his careful old general Parmenion offered the sensible advice. The river was an obstacle, the banks were steep, the enemy was waiting on higher ground, and attacking across a watercourse uphill into massed cavalry was the kind of plan that gets armies killed. Far better, Parmenion suggested, to make camp, rest the men, and cross the river at first light when the Persians would be unprepared and the army could form up properly on the far side. It was once again the prudent and correct military advice, and once again Alexander rejected it out of hand, declaring that he would be ashamed if, having just crossed the great strait dividing two continents, he should now be intimidated by a mere stream. It was equal parts bravado and calculation, because he also understood that a sudden, aggressive attack would catch the enemy off balance, and that hesitation would only let the Persians grow more confident. So he attacked, more or less immediately, straight across the river and up the slippery bank into the waiting enemy. What followed was a chaotic, churning melee fought in the water and the mud, with the famous pike formations largely useless on such broken, uneven ground, and the battle dissolving into a furious cavalry brawl. Alexander naturally plunged into the thickest part of it, conspicuous in his gleaming armour and distinctive plumed helmet, which made him an obvious target for every Persian noble eager to win eternal glory by killing the invading king. His spear shattered in the fighting and he had to call for another. He was, in short, doing exactly the kind of thing that gives bodyguards heart attacks, and then came the moment that would echo darkly through the rest of his life. In the swirl of the fight, a Persian nobleman named Spithridates managed to get into position behind the king with his blade raised, an instant away from ending the entire invasion before it had really begun. The whole of subsequent history hung on a single heartbeat. It was saved by one of Alexander's officers, a tough and loyal cavalry commander known as Clytus the Black, who reacted in time to strike the attacker down and stop the killing blow before it landed. Alexander survived, the battle was won, and he owed his life directly to Clytus the Black. Hold on to that name and that debt, because years later, in a moment of drunken rage far to the east, that same loyal officer and that same king would have a falling out so catastrophic that it stains Alexander's memory to this day. For now, though, Clytus was simply the man who saved the king, and the king fought on. The Persian cavalry, who had borne the brunt of the fighting and lost many of their leading noblemen, eventually broke and fled the field. That left the large body of hired Greek infantry, Memnon's professionals, stranded and surrounded with their employers gone. They sent word offering to surrender on terms, which was a perfectly reasonable request from soldiers who had simply been doing their paid job. Alexander refused. He was, after all, leading an officially sanctioned Greek war of vengeance, and in his eyes these were Greeks who had betrayed the common cause by selling their swords to the enemy. He made a harsh example of them, and the survivors were sent back in chains to labour as a warning to any other Greeks tempted to take Persian money. It was a cold, deliberate political message rather than a fit of temper, though Alexander was perfectly capable of both, and it announced in the bluntest possible way that this war had rules and that breaking them carried a steep price. In the aftermath of his first victory on Asian soil, Alexander did something that revealed how carefully he managed his image back home. He gathered up a large quantity of captured Persian armour and shipped it back to Athens as a war trophy, with a pointed dedication declaring that these spoils had been won from the foreigners of Asia by Alexander and the Greeks, with the notable exception of the Spartans. It was a small, sharp dig at the one famous city that had refused to join his alliance, a way of publicly reminding everyone exactly who had stayed home while the glory was being won. The man understood public relations centuries before anyone gave it a name. He was equally deliberate in how he treated his own. The Macedonians who had fallen in the river fight were buried with full honours, and Alexander reportedly granted their families exemption from taxes and other public burdens, a gesture that cost him relatively little and bought him an enormous amount of loyalty. An army that knows its king will honour the dead and look after the families they leave behind is an army that will follow that king up a muddy riverbank into a wall of cavalry, which is precisely the point. He also tended to the wounded personally, going among them, listening to their accounts of the fight, and letting each man tell his story, which soldiers tend to appreciate far more than fine speeches. This was leadership as a kind of theatre, but it was sincere theatre, and it worked. There was a political dimension to the conquest as well, one that softened the image of a foreign army marching through the region. Many of the cities along this coast were old Greek settlements that had lived under Persian-backed rulers, and Alexander presented himself not as a conqueror seizing them, but as a liberator freeing them, often sweeping away the unpopular local strongmen and allowing the cities to govern themselves in the manner they preferred. Whether this was heartfelt idealism or shrewd calculation is a question that follows Alexander everywhere, and the honest answer is almost always both at once. Freeing the Greek cities cost him nothing, won him goodwill, weakened Persian influence, and fit beautifully with the story he was telling back home about a grand war of liberation. The fact that it was also genuinely popular with the people being liberated was a happy bonus. Now came one of the smartest strategic decisions of the entire war, and it had nothing to do with a battle. The Persian Empire commanded a powerful navy that vastly outmatched anything Alexander could put to sea. A fleet that could in theory cut his supply lines, raid the coast of Greece, and stir up rebellion behind him while he marched inland. A lesser commander might have tried to build up his own fleet and challenge them at sea, which would almost certainly have ended in disaster. Alexander did something far more clever. He decided to defeat the navy on land. His reasoning was beautifully simple. A fleet, no matter how powerful, needs harbours. It needs ports to resupply, to take on fresh water, to shelter and repair. So if he captured every single port along the coast, the mighty Persian navy would have nowhere to land, nowhere to drink, and nowhere to hide, and it would slowly become useless without his ships ever having to fight a single sea battle. He even disbanded most of his own modest fleet, a bold move that saved money and, conveniently, ensured his soldiers understood there would be no easy escape by sea. Victory was now the only way home, so he turned his army into a port-clearing operation up and down the coast. The wealthy provincial capital of Sardis, with its rich treasury, simply opened its gates and surrendered without a fight, which was a delightful outcome for everyone except the Persian treasury. The great trading city of Ephesus welcomed him. Some places resisted, and those he took by force. The city of Miletus held out under the watchful eye of the Persian fleet, which sat just offshore and could only float there impotently, unable to land and help while Alexander stormed the walls, a perfect early demonstration that his land-based strategy was working exactly as planned. The toughest nut was the city of Halicarnassus, where Memnon himself, the one truly dangerous mind on the Persian side, organised a stubborn and skillful defence. Alexander eventually took the city after hard fighting, though parts of the fortified strongpoints held out for a while longer. One by one, the doors the Persian fleet depended on were being slammed shut. The fight for Halicarnassus also offered the first real glimpse of why Alexander's army was so feared at attacking walls, not just defending against them. His engineers brought up siege towers and battering rams, filled in the defensive ditches under fire, and methodically chipped away at the city's formidable fortifications, while the defenders made sudden sorties to burn the equipment and were driven back each time. It became a grinding contest of engineering and willpower, the kind of patient, brutal work that decided far more ancient campaigns than the glamorous open battles ever did. The defenders, recognizing that the walls could not hold forever, eventually set fire to much of the city themselves and withdrew to the fortified positions by the harbour, denying Alexander a clean prize. It was a preview of the even more famous and far more grueling sieges that lay ahead, and an early sign that taking a determined city would test his army in ways that no cavalry charge ever could. It was somewhere on this campaign that one of the most famous legends of his entire life took place, at a town called Gordium. There, according to ancient tradition, stood an old wagon tied to a post with an impossibly complicated knot, a tangle so cunningly woven that nobody could find where it began or ended. An ancient prophecy declared that whoever managed to undo this Gordian knot would become the ruler of all Asia, which was exactly the sort of cosmic challenge Alexander could not possibly walk past. He examined the knot, fiddled with it for a bit, and when it stubbornly refused to come undone by ordinary means, he reportedly drew his sword and simply sliced straight through it, declaring that it made no difference how the knot was loosed so long as it was loosed. Some versions claim he found a cleverer solution by pulling out the pin holding it together, but the sword story is the one everyone remembers, and either way the message is the same. Alexander was not a man to let a technicality stand between himself and a prophecy of world rule. If the universe was going to offer him a sign of his destiny, he was perfectly happy to give the universe a little help. There remained one genuine danger hanging over all of this, and his name was Memnon. While Alexander pushed along the coast, the Persian king finally recognized the threat and gave the brilliant Greek mercenary supreme command of the war at sea, along with a fleet and the resources to wage it. Memnon began doing exactly what Alexander feared most, taking the offensive in the Aegean, seizing islands, and threatening to carry the war across the water into Greece itself, where rebellion was always simmering just beneath the surface. Had he succeeded in opening a second front behind Alexander's back, the whole Eastern campaign might have been forced to turn around and rush home, and the history of the world would read very differently. It was the single most serious strategic threat the invasion had yet faced, and then Memnon got sick and died, just like that. The one opponent capable of genuinely derailing the entire enterprise, the man whose advice could have starved the invasion to death, and whose strategy threatened to set Greece ablaze, was carried off by a sudden illness in the middle of his campaign, before he could bring his plan to fruition. The danger from the sea, the threat that no sword had been able to remove, was quietly erased by a fever. Alexander had a habit throughout his life of benefiting from this kind of fortune at exactly the right moment, and his enemies could be forgiven for wondering whether the gods really were on his side after all. It is one of those moments where history seems to hold its breath, change its mind, and quietly hand the advantage back to the bolder man for no reason anyone could explain. With Memnon gone, the naval threat unravelled, and the road inland lay open. The young king had cleared the coast, neutralised the fleet without a sea battle, fulfilled a prophecy of world rule, and survived his first brush with death in Asia. But he had not yet faced the great king in person. That reckoning was coming, and this time Darius himself would be waiting. That reckoning did not arrive immediately, and when it finally came it was preceded by an episode that nearly ended Alexander's life, without any help from the Persians at all. As his army pushed deeper into Asia Minor, the king, hot and exhausted from the march, decided to cool off with a swim in an icy mountain river. This turned out to be a poor decision. He came down with a violent, dangerous fever, and for a while it looked as though the great conqueror of the known world might be carried off by a cold dip and bad luck rather than by any enemy. His physicians were terrified to treat him, knowing that if the king died in their care they would not be thanked for their efforts. Only one doctor, a man named Philip, was bold enough to prepare a strong medicine to break the fever. And here the story produces one of those moments that tells you everything about Alexander's character. Just as the doctor was preparing the drink, the king received a letter warning him that this very physician had been bribed by the Persians to poison him. Alexander, rather than panicking or arresting the man, did something almost theatrical in its confidence. He took the cup of medicine in one hand and handed the doctor the incriminating letter with the other, then drank the potion down while the physician read the accusation against himself. It was a stunning gesture of trust, a way of saying that he would rather die trusting a loyal man than live suspecting a good one. The doctor, presumably relieved beyond words, watched his king recover, and Alexander emerged from the brush with death more convinced than ever that ordinary fates did not apply to him. While he was lying ill, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically, because Darius, the great king of Persia, had finally decided that this young invader was a serious problem worth handling personally. It is worth knowing a little about this Darius, because he is too often remembered simply as the man who kept running away. He had come to the throne relatively recently and through a tangle of court intrigue, elevated to power amid the kind of palace plotting and convenient deaths that tended to surround the Persian succession, and he had not held the crown long enough to feel entirely secure on it. By personal accounts, he was tall, dignified, and physically brave, a competent man thrust into an impossible situation against an opponent, unlike anything the empire had faced before. He was not a coward or a fool. He was simply an ordinary, capable ruler matched against a once-in-a-thousand-years military genius, which is a thoroughly unfair contest, and history has not been kind to the man on the losing end of it. He gathered an enormous army from across his vast empire, a host that ancient writers numbered in the hundreds of thousands, though those figures are almost certainly wild exaggerations, and he marched it westward to crush Alexander once and for all. What happened next was a comedy of mutual confusion that decided the fate of two empires. The two armies, each looking for the other, essentially marched right past one another in the rugged coastal country, missing each other entirely. Darius ended up coming out behind Alexander, between the Macedonian army and its line of supply and retreat, near a town called Issus. There he found a number of sick and wounded Macedonians whom Alexander had left behind to recover, and the Persians treated these helpless men with great cruelty, which, when word of it reached the main army, did nothing to improve the mood of Alexander's soldiers. If Darius had hoped to intimidate the invaders, he had instead handed them a personal grievance to fight over. When Alexander first received the news that the entire Persian royal army was now sitting squarely behind him, he reportedly did not believe it, and sent a scout ship to confirm the report because the idea seemed too strange to be true. But once it was confirmed, he was, of all things, delighted, and with good reason. Darius had blundered into a trap of his own making. By positioning his gigantic army in a narrow coastal plain hemmed in between the mountains on one side and the sea on the other, a battlefield only a couple of miles wide, the great king had thrown away his single greatest advantage. All those hundreds of thousands of men could not possibly be brought to bear on such a cramped front. Most of them would simply stand uselessly at the back, unable to reach the fighting, while a force their own size met them head-on. Darius had managed to bring an overwhelming army to a place where being overwhelming did not help him at all. It was, to put it kindly, not his finest piece of staff work. Alexander turned his army around and marched back to give battle. The Persians had drawn up behind a small river that ran across the narrow plain, with Darius himself positioned in the centre surrounded by his royal guard, his contingent of hired Greek infantry, and the cream of his cavalry massed on the wing nearest the sea. The Macedonian dispositions followed the familiar pattern that had served them so well, with the seasoned Parmenian commanding the left flank down by the shore, under strict orders to hold the line no matter what, while Alexander took his place on the right with the companion cavalry, looking for the opening he intended to exploit. The fighting opened with the Persian cavalry by the sea, hurling themselves at Parmenian's wing in a ferocious assault, and the old general had his hands full holding them back, which was precisely his role, to absorb the pressure and refuse to break. In the centre, the great pike formation pushed across the river, but the rough ground and the steep banks disordered the careful ranks, opening dangerous gaps, and Darius's Greek mercenaries, themselves no amateurs, poured into those gaps and very nearly threw the Macedonian centre back into the water. For a moment the battle hung in the balance, with the heart of Alexander's army in serious trouble. It was the king himself who tipped it. On the right, Alexander led his companion cavalry in a hard charge across the river, smashed through the Persian troops opposite him, and then, instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy, did the disciplined and devastating thing. He wheeled his cavalry inward and drove straight toward the centre of the Persian line, aiming directly at Darius himself. This was the hammer falling exactly where it would do the most damage, while the infantry pinned the rest of the enemy in place. As the Macedonian wedge cut its way toward the great king, the fighting around the royal chariot grew desperate, and Darius found himself staring at the very real prospect of the enemy king reaching him in person. He did not stay to find out how that would go. Darius turned his chariot and fled the battlefield, and when the rough ground made the chariot too slow, he abandoned it and escaped on horseback, racing away from the field while his army still fought. The flight of the great king did what the loss of any number of soldiers could not. The moment word spread that Darius had run, Persian morale collapsed entirely, and the vast army dissolved into a panicked rout, the masses at the rear who had never even reached the fighting now trampling each other in their rush to escape through the narrow exits. It was a catastrophic defeat snatched from what should have been an overwhelming numerical advantage. The cost to the two sides could hardly have been more lopsided. Persian losses in the rout and the deadly crush at the narrow exits were enormous, while Alexander's army, though it had endured some hard fighting in the centre and along the shore, came through with comparatively modest casualties. Alexander himself did not escape entirely unscathed, taking a wound to the thigh during the fighting, which he characteristically shrugged off, and which only added to his growing reputation as a king who shared every danger with his men rather than directing the battle from a safe distance. The contrast wrote itself, and Alexander's storytellers made sure it was not lost on anyone. On one side, a young king bleeding from a thigh wound he barely acknowledged, having personally led the charge that broke the enemy. On the other, the great king of the largest empire on earth, galloping away on a borrowed horse before the issue was even fully decided. In an age that measured rulers by their courage in battle, that single image did more damage to Darius than any number of casualties. The aftermath produced some of the most revealing moments of Alexander's entire life, and they had nothing to do with fighting. In his haste to flee, Darius had left behind his entire camp, including the royal pavilion and, far more significantly, the members of his own family who had accompanied the army, among them his mother, his wife, and his young children. They now found themselves prisoners of the conquering enemy, expecting the worst, since the worst was what usually happened to the captured family of a defeated king. What they got instead was almost startling in its courtesy. Alexander treated the Persian royal women with genuine respect, allowing them to keep their royal status, their attendance, and their dignity, and assuring them they would be cared for as the queens they were. It was partly calculated, of course, since gracious treatment of the great king's family was an enormous statement about who the real ruler of Asia now intended to be. But it also reflected something real in Alexander's complicated character, a streak of chivalry that coexisted, sometimes uneasily, with his capacity for ruthlessness. There is a charming story attached to this moment. When Alexander and his closest friend Hephaestion went together to visit the captive royal women, the elderly queen mother, not knowing which man was the king, bowed in respect to Hephaestion, who was the taller and more imposing of the two. When she realized her mistake and began to apologize in terror, Alexander reportedly waved it away with perfect grace, telling her she had made no error at all, because Hephaestion too was an Alexander, a friend who was a second version of himself. It is a small kindness, but it tells you how deep that particular friendship ran, and how secure Alexander felt in his own position. A more insecure conqueror would have been furious at being overlooked. Alexander turned it into a compliment to his best friend. He was equally struck by the staggering luxury of the captured Persian royal tent, with its gold and silver vessels, its perfumed baths, and its furnishings of a richness the rough Macedonians had never imagined. Surveying the bathtubs and basins and ointment jars of solid precious metal, Alexander is said to have remarked dryly that this, apparently, was what it meant to be a king. Coming from a kingdom where the royal household was considerably more modest, the contrast was not lost on him, though one suspects he adapted to the upgraded accommodations with very little difficulty. In the months that followed, Darius, now desperate to recover his family and stop the bleeding, sent a series of letters proposing peace, and his offers grew steadily more generous as his situation grew steadily worse. He offered an enormous ransom for his captured relatives. He offered a large sum of money and a substantial chunk of his empire up to a major river. He offered his daughter in marriage and a formal alliance, essentially proposing to split the known world and become partners. According to the famous story, when this offer was read aloud in the war council, the cautious Parmenion remarked that if he were Alexander, he would accept such generous terms. Alexander shot back that he would accept them too if he were Parmenion. He had no intention of settling for half of anything. His reply to Darius was that the world could not have two sons, that he had no need to be offered what was already his to take, and that if Darius wanted to discuss his family or his kingdom, he should come and address Alexander as the lord of all Asia. It was breathtaking arrogance, but it was the arrogance of a man who had now beaten the great king himself in open battle, and who genuinely believed the entire empire was simply waiting to fall into his hands. That confidence was backed by something more solid than belief, because the victory at Issus had also delivered an enormous financial windfall. Darius, like any king marching to war, had brought along a vast baggage train stuffed with treasure to pay and supply his army, and much of it had been sent for safekeeping to a wealthy city inland. Alexander dispatched the reliable Parmenion to seize it, and the old general scooped up a staggering haul of gold, silver, and precious goods, along with many noble Persian captives, for an invasion that had started out as the gamble of a cash-strapped young king from a modest kingdom. This sudden injection of Persian wealth was transformative. War is ferociously expensive, and Alexander had just been handed the means to pay for a great deal more of it, courtesy of the very empire he was dismantling. There is a certain grim efficiency in conquering an enemy using the money you took from him at the last battle. Rather than immediately charging east in pursuit of the fleeing Darius, however, Alexander did the patient, strategic thing, continuing down the coast to finish securing the entire Mediterranean seaboard before plunging into the heart of the empire. This was the same logic that had guided him from the start, the determination to deny the Persian navy its harbours and to leave no enemy stronghold at his back. Most of the wealthy trading cities of the Phoenician coast, whose ships and crews made up the backbone of the Persian fleet, took one look at the situation after Issus and prudently opened their gates, which effectively finished off Persian sea power for good without a single major naval battle. Their surrender handed Alexander not only their cities but also their ships, which would prove very useful indeed before long. One of these Phoenician cities produced an anecdote so charming that it has survived for over 2,000 years. In a city whose ruler Alexander chose to depose, the task of finding a worthy replacement fell to one of his officers, who was instructed to select someone of genuine royal blood. After the obvious wealthy candidates fell over themselves competing for the honour, the search turned up a distant relative of the old royal line who had fallen on hard times and was discovered working as a humble gardener, watering vegetables in a quiet plot, blissfully unaware of the political storm around him. This man, plucked from his garden, washed up, and informed that he was now a king, is said to have handled his sudden promotion with such calm dignity and good sense that he became the model of a ruler who had earned his crown through character rather than ambition. It is the kind of story that may have improved in the retelling, but it captured something the ancient world found appealing, the idea that the best ruler might be the one who never wanted the job in the first place. Alexander, who had wanted every job in existence since roughly the age of 12, seems to have found it admirable all the same. One city, however, refused to play along, and it would cost Alexander 7 months and a great deal of effort. The ancient city of Tyre sat on a rocky island just off the coast, protected by the sea and by massive walls that rose straight out of the water, and its people had no intention of simply handing themselves over. When Alexander requested permission to enter the city and offer a sacrifice at the temple of their chief god, the Tyrians, trying to walk a careful line between the two great powers without fully committing to either, politely suggested he use a temple on the mainland instead. It was a diplomatic way of saying no while pretending not to, the ancient equivalent of telling someone the position has been filled. Alexander, who did not handle that sort of evasion well, took it as an unacceptable challenge to his authority, and resolved to take the city no matter what it required. The problem was that Tyre sat on an island, and at this point Alexander had given away most of his own fleet and could not simply storm it from the sea. So he did something that perfectly captures the combination of engineering brilliance and sheer stubbornness that defined him. He decided to build a road to the island. His soldiers and engineers began constructing an enormous causeway, a solid mole of stone and timber and rubble stretching out from the mainland across the open water toward the island walls, intending to march his army straight up to the city as if the sea were not even there. It was a staggering undertaking, the kind of project that makes you wonder who first proposed it, and whether anyone present quietly suggested they perhaps reconsider. The Tyrians naturally did everything in their power to stop it. They rained arrows and missiles down on the workers from their walls and from ships. They attacked the construction from the water, and as the causeway crept closer, the work became more dangerous by the day. Alexander responded by building 2 gigantic siege towers at the end of the mole to protect the labourers and to fire back at the defenders. The Tyrians answered that by sending a vessel packed with flammable materials, essentially a floating bomb, which they set ablaze and steered into the towers, burning Alexander's elaborate works to the ground in a single spectacular stroke. It was a maddening setback, and a lesser commander might have given up and moved on. Alexander simply widened the causeway, rebuilt the towers, and pressed on, his patience apparently as inexhaustible as his ambition. The Tyrians, for their part, were far from beaten and proved to be ingenious defenders, which only prolonged the misery on both sides. They mounted war engines of their own along the walls to hurl stones and missiles at the approaching works. They dropped great blocks of stone into the water to foul the seabed and keep Alexander's ships from getting close, and they devised clever contraptions to grapple and overturn the besiegers' equipment or to drop heavy weights onto anyone who got near the base of the walls. When Alexander's newly arrived fleet tried to blockade the two harbours of the island, the Tyrians staged a daring surprise sortie with their own ships, slipping out to attack the blockading vessels before being driven back. Every advance Alexander made was met with some new countermeasure, and the siege became a long, grinding duel of engineering wits, each side inventing fresh ways to thwart the other. The defenders fought with the desperate energy of people who knew exactly what defeat would mean, which lent their resistance a ferocity that impressed even their attackers. The decisive change came when the Phoenician and Cypriot cities that had recently surrendered sent their fleets to join him, giving Alexander the naval power he had lacked. Now he could blockade the island, surround it, and bring his siege engines against the walls from ships as well as from the causeway. Under relentless pressure from every direction, the great walls of Tyre were finally breached, and the Macedonians stormed into the city. After 7 months of bitter resistance, the long siege ended, and it ended harshly. The defenders had executed some captured Macedonians on the walls earlier in the siege, in full view of the besiegers, which had hardened Alexander's mood considerably, and the conquered city paid a terrible price, with many of its people killed and most of the survivors sold into slavery. It was a brutal conclusion, but it sent the unmistakable message Alexander intended, which was that resistance against him, however heroic, would not be rewarded with mercy. The fall of Tyre, long considered nearly impregnable, echoed across the region, and most remaining cities took the hint. There was one more holdout on the way south, the city of Gaza, which guarded the route into Egypt and was defended with great determination by its commander. Gaza sat atop a high mound, which made it difficult to approach, so Alexander had his engineers build an enormous artificial ramp of earth to bring his siege engines up to the level of the walls, another feat of patient construction. The defenders fought hard and made repeated sorties, and during the fighting Alexander himself was wounded in the shoulder by a missile, a reminder that even now he insisted on placing himself in the danger zone. Eventually the walls were undermined and breached, and Gaza too fell after a stubborn defence. With it, the last obstacle between Alexander and Egypt was gone. Egypt, as it turned out, did not require a fight at all. The Persian governor of the province, lacking any real means to resist after the disasters at Issus and along the coast, and acutely aware that no help was coming, simply surrendered the entire country, along with its treasury, without offering battle, which was a wonderfully sensible decision on his part. The Egyptians, for their part, were not sorry to see the Persians go. They had chafed under Persian rule for a long time, resenting both the heavy taxation and what they saw as Persian disrespect for their ancient gods and customs. So when Alexander arrived, he was received not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, which was becoming something of a recurring theme in his career. Alexander, ever attentive to the politics of religion, played the role perfectly. At the old capital of Memphis, he made a great show of honouring the Egyptian gods and respecting the traditions the Persians had supposedly trampled on, taking care to pay public reverence to the sacred animals and ancient rituals the Egyptians held dear, and the grateful priesthood received him with open arms and recognized him as their new pharaoh, the legitimate ruler of Egypt in the ancient line of god-kings. For a young man from a small northern kingdom, being crowned as the living embodiment of an Egyptian tradition thousands of years old was a remarkable elevation, and it fed the growing sense, both in his own mind and in the stories told about him, that he was something more than an ordinary king. When it came to actually governing Egypt, Alexander made a shrewd and revealing decision. Rather than handing the enormously wealthy and easily defensible province to a single all-powerful governor, which would have created the perfect base for an ambitious man to break away and set himself up as an independent ruler, he deliberately split the authority among several officials, separating civil administration, military command, and financial control into different hands. It was the act of a man who, for all his youthful glory-seeking, understood power and human nature very well, and who had no intention of creating a rival in the richest corner of his new domain. He had, after all, grown up in a court where over-mighty subjects were a constant danger, and the lesson had clearly stuck. Egypt would be loyal, profitable, and crucially manageable from a distance. It was here, at the western mouth of the Nile, that Alexander did the thing he loved most and founded a city. He had founded settlements before and would found many more, but this one was different. Surveying a promising spot on the coast between the sea and a lake, with a fine natural harbour, he personally laid out the plans for a great new city to bear his name, sketching out where the walls, the marketplace and the temples would stand. There is a charming legend that, lacking chalk to mark the boundaries, the workers used barley flour, and that flocks of birds promptly descended and ate the lines, which the anxious seers interpreted after some quick thinking as a sign that the city would become so prosperous it would feed people from many lands. The city he founded there, his Alexandria, would go on to become one of the greatest centres of trade, learning and culture in the entire ancient world, outlasting his empire by many centuries and standing as by far his most enduring monument. Of all the cities that carried his name, and there were a good number of them, this was the one that truly mattered, his calling card to the future. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander undertook a strange and difficult journey that mattered enormously to him personally, even if it accomplished nothing military. He set off across the desert to a remote oasis far to the west, where there stood a famous and ancient oracle of a great god the Greeks identified with their own supreme deity. The trek across the sands was dangerous, and later storytellers filled it with marvels, describing a sudden rain that saved the parched expedition, and birds or serpents that guided the lost travellers to their destination, the kind of details that tend to attach themselves to a man who has already become a legend in his own lifetime. When he finally reached the oracle, the priest greeted him in a manner that Alexander and his companions understood as confirmation that he was the son of the god himself. Whatever was actually said in that desert sanctuary, and the truth is lost to us, Alexander emerged from it apparently convinced of his own divine parentage, and the idea that he was not merely a king but the offspring of a god took deep root in him. This belief would shape and eventually distort much of what came later, growing into a need for forms of reverence that his down-to-earth Macedonian soldiers would find increasingly difficult to stomach. For now, though, it filled him with an even greater sense of unstoppable destiny as he prepared to turn at last toward the heart of the Persian Empire. It is worth noting that not everyone shared the king's enthusiasm for his upgraded ancestry. To the practical, plain-spoken Macedonian veterans, the notion that the boy they had watched grow up, the son of their old one-eyed king, was now somehow the offspring of a god, was a difficult idea to take entirely seriously. They had known his very mortal father. They had seen Alexander bleed on the battlefield more than once, most recently at Gaza. A man who needs a doctor and gets wounded by ordinary arrows is, by most reasonable definitions, fairly mortal. Many of them humoured the claim out of loyalty and the genuine awe his achievements inspired, but a quiet scepticism lingered in the ranks, the sort of thing soldiers grumble about around a campfire when the king is not listening. That gap between how Alexander increasingly saw himself and how his oldest companions saw him would widen dangerously in the years ahead, but in Egypt it was still only a faint crack, easily ignored amid the triumphs. While all of this unfolded in Egypt, trouble had been brewing back home in Greece, as it tended to do whenever Alexander was far enough away to seem absent. The one Greek state that had famously refused to join his grand alliance, proud Sparta, saw its opportunity and, backed by Persian money, raised a revolt in the southern part of Greece under its king, aiming to throw off Macedonian dominance while the conqueror was busy on the far side of the world. It was a genuine threat, and for a moment it looked as though the home front might catch fire. But Alexander had left the steady, capable General Antipater in charge of Macedonia and Greece precisely to handle this kind of situation, and Antipater did his job. He gathered an army, marched south, and crushed the Spartan revolt in a hard-fought battle, in which the rebel king himself was killed. The uprising collapsed, and Alexander's rear was secure once more. Managing the home front, it should be said, was no simple matter for Antipater, who had to balance not only restless Greek cities, but also the formidable and famously difficult Olympias, Alexander's mother, with whom he carried on a long and bitter feud through a steady stream of complaining letters sent all the way to the king in Asia. Alexander, when he eventually heard about this serious revolt that had been put down in his absence, is said to have dismissed it with a touch of lofty condescension, referring to the whole affair as a mere battle of mice compared to the world-shaping events he was orchestrating in Asia. It was an unfair characterization, since the fighting back home had been real and dangerous, but it captured exactly where his attention now lay. To Alexander, Greece was already settled business, a secured base camp rather than a prize. His eyes were fixed entirely on the east, on the wealth of Babylon and the great cities of the Persian heartland, and above all on Darius, who was even now gathering one final massive army for a last desperate attempt to save his empire. The coast was conquered, Egypt was his, and the time for chasing the great king to a final decisive reckoning had finally come. So Alexander led his army back out of Egypt and turned inland, marching east across the great rivers toward the very centre of Persian power. Darius, twice beaten but still in command of the deepest reserves of manpower and wealth on earth, had not given up. He had retreated far into his own territory, summoned fresh contingents from the most distant corners of his realm, and was assembling a host even larger than the one that had failed at Issus, this time choosing the ground himself, and determined not to repeat the mistake of fighting in a place too cramped to use his numbers. The two kings were on a collision course toward an open plain where there would be no rivers to cross, no narrow defiles to even the odds, and no excuses for either side. Everything that had happened so far, the river crossing at the start, the chase along the coast, the sieges and the crownings and the desert pilgrimage, had been the prelude. What came next would decide who truly ruled Asia. The march to that open plain took Alexander deep into the heart of Mesopotamia, across the two great rivers that had cradled civilizations for thousands of years before either king was born. It was a punishing journey through the baking heat of late summer, the kind of march that grinds down men and animals alike, and Alexander deliberately led his army on a northern route where the climate was a little less murderous and supplies a little easier to find, because as established, he understood that an army marches on its stomach and dies of an empty one. Darius made no serious attempt to defend the river crossings, which told Alexander everything he needed to know. The great king was no longer trying to stop the invasion at the border. He was gambling everything on a single enormous battle on ground of his own choosing, and he had chosen a wide, flat plain in the north of his empire near a place called Gaugamela, not far from a city that still exists today. This time there would be no narrow defile to cramp his numbers, no river to disorder his attack, no excuses. Darius had learned the lesson of his earlier defeat, or so he believed. He would meet Alexander on open ground where his vast superiority in numbers could finally be brought fully to bear. Before it came to blows, Darius made one last attempt at diplomacy, and his offer this time was almost desperate in its generosity. He proposed to hand over an enormous portion of his empire, all the territory west of the Great River, along with a vast sum of money and a marriage alliance sealed by his own daughter, in exchange for peace and the return of his captured family. It was, by any normal measure, a staggering concession, the kind of offer that would have made any ordinary conqueror in history retire as a fabulously wealthy and triumphant man. Alexander, who had never once shown the slightest interest in being ordinary, turned it down flat. Half an empire held no appeal to a man who fully intended to take all of it, and he had no use for a treaty when he believed the whole prize was already within his grasp. Darius, having exhausted every avenue short of surrender, was left with no choice but to fight, and he had been busy. Determined to use every advantage the terrain allowed, Darius had his men physically level and smooth the chosen battlefield, clearing away rocks and filling in the rough patches, all to create a perfectly groomed surface for the secret weapon he was counting on, a fleet of around 200 scythed chariots. These were war chariots fitted with cruel blades projecting from the wheels and the yoke, designed to be driven at full gallop straight into enemy infantry, slicing through the ranks and scattering them in terror before the main armies even clashed. On smooth ground, charging into a tightly packed enemy, they could in theory be devastating. It was an ancient and intimidating weapon, the kind of thing that looks utterly terrifying in principle, and, as we shall see, somewhat less so when the people facing it have actually thought about the problem in advance. The army Darius assembled for this final stand was a genuine cross-section of the largest empire on earth, drawn from every corner of his vast domain. There were horsemen from the wild eastern provinces, heavily armoured cavalry, archers, and infantry contingents speaking a dozen different languages, gathered together in numbers that ancient writers, as usual, inflated to fantastical and frankly impossible figures. The realistic estimates still put the Persian force somewhere in the range of many tens of thousands, comfortably outnumbering Alexander's army by something like 2 to 1. Darius even brought along a small number of war elephants from the eastern reaches of his empire, enormous beasts that most of the Macedonians had never encountered in battle before. The elephants did not play a major part on the day, but they made an impression, and they were a quiet preview of a far more frightening encounter that awaited Alexander years later in India. For now they simply stood there, large and ominous, like a warning the Macedonians did not yet know how to read. To soldiers who had grown up in the hills and plains of Greece, the sight of these mountainous animals, with their strange trumpeting and their sheer impossible size, must have been deeply unsettling, the sort of thing that gives men pause no matter how many battles they have won. War elephants were the ancient equivalent of bringing something to a fight that your opponent has simply never seen before and has no idea how to handle. As the two armies camped within sight of each other, the heavens themselves seemed to weigh in. On the night before the battle there was a total eclipse of the moon, which slowly turned dark and blood-red in the sky, an event that filled both camps with dread and was eagerly interpreted by the priests and seers on both sides. To the superstitious soldiers, an omen like this could break morale before a single blow was struck. Alexander, who understood the power of belief as well as he understood the power of cavalry, made sure his own seers interpreted the eclipse favourably for the Macedonians, reassuring his men that the gods were signalling the fall of the Persian Empire rather than their own doom. The Persians, by various accounts, read the same sign as a warning of disaster, same eclipse, two very different forecasts, which is roughly how omens have always worked. That night also produced one of the most telling little scenes of Alexander's career. The ever-cautious Parmenion, looking at the sheer size of the enemy host and the difficulty of the situation, advised the king to attack under cover of darkness, hoping a night assault might offset the Persian advantage in numbers and catch them off guard. Alexander rejected the idea, declaring that he would not steal a victory like a thief, that he intended to beat Darius in broad daylight and openly, leaving the great king no excuse of bad luck or trickery to explain away his defeat. It was partly genuine pride and partly shrewd calculation, since a night battle is chaotic and unpredictable and could easily go wrong against a larger force. But the most famous part of the story comes the next morning, when Alexander reportedly slept so soundly and so late that his officers had to wake him, astonished that a man about to fight the most important battle of his life could be napping peacefully while the enemy assembled. When roused, he explained, with the calm of a man who has already worked out exactly how he is going to win, that he felt as though the battle was already decided, because Darius had finally agreed to fight him in the open. Whether or not he slept quite that well, the point of the story is clear. He had a plan, and he trusted it completely. That plan was a masterpiece of dealing with a problem that had no obvious solution, namely how to win a battle on flat, open ground against an enemy who outnumbers you 2-1 and can therefore stretch his line far beyond yours and simply wrap around your flanks. On the coast and in the mountains, terrain had protected Alexander's flanks. Here there was nothing but open plain in every direction, an invitation to be surrounded. So Alexander did something clever. Rather than forming a single straight line that would inevitably be outflanked, he arranged his army into a formation with refused flanks, and crucially a second line of troops positioned behind the first, facing backward, ready to turn and fight off any enemy who managed to get around or break through. In effect, he built a formation that could fight in multiple directions at once, a hollow box of disciplined infantry that could not be easily enveloped because it had no soft, exposed rear to envelop. If the Persians wrapped around the sides, they would simply run into more spears facing the other way. He also stationed mixed groups of cavalry and fast light infantry at angles on the corners of this formation, like the cocked elbows of a boxer, specifically tasked with peeling off to meet any flanking attempt before it could close around the main body. It was the answer of a man who had looked hard at an impossible problem and found the hidden flaw, exactly as he had once done with a frightened horse. The plan was also informed by good homework. Before committing to anything, Alexander had personally ridden out to study the ground Darius had chosen, surveying the smoothed battlefield and the enemy dispositions with his own eyes, and his scouts had snapped up Persian prisoners who revealed the details of what awaited them, including the cleared lanes for the chariots and the layout of the enemy line. Forewarned about the chariots in particular, Alexander could prepare his men for the precise threat, rather than meeting it as a nasty surprise, which made all the difference when the blades came rolling across the plain. It is remarkable how much less frightening a secret weapon becomes once it is no longer a secret. When the battle opened, Alexander did something that must have looked bizarre to the watching Persians. Instead of charging straight ahead, he began leading his right wing on a steady diagonal march off to the side, edging his whole army rightward across the plain. This had a deliberate and devious purpose. It threatened to carry the fighting off the carefully smoothed ground that Darius had prepared for his precious chariots, and it forced the Persian left wing to keep shifting and extending to stay opposite him, stretching their line thinner and thinner as they tried to match the movement. The Persian cavalry on that wing eventually launched fierce attacks to stop the rightward drift, and a furious, swirling cavalry battle erupted on the flank as Alexander fed in his troops to hold them, all the while watching, waiting, for the one thing he needed. On the far side of the plain, meanwhile, the superb Thessalian horsemen under Parmenion were locked in their own desperate struggle against the cream of the Persian cavalry, holding the line through sheer stubbornness and skill exactly as that wing always did, buying their king the time he needed at a fearful cost. As the Persians shifted and committed their forces to counter his manoeuvre, a gap began to open in their stretched and weakened centre, precisely where the great king himself was stationed. Darius, meanwhile, unleashed his terrifying scythed chariots, sending them thundering across the plain toward the Macedonian line. And here the careful preparation of Alexander's army turned the dreaded weapon into an embarrassment. As the chariots approached, his fast, light troops, including his beloved javelin-throwing Agrianians and his archers, swarmed forward and targeted the horses and the drivers, bringing many of the chariots down before they ever reached the line. Those that did get through met a Macedonian infantry that had been carefully drilled for exactly this moment. Instead of standing in a solid wall to be sliced apart, the disciplined ranks simply opened up, parting to create wide lanes through the formation and allowing the chariots to rumble harmlessly straight through into the empty space behind, where they were dealt with at leisure by the troops waiting in the rear. The fearsome scythed chariots, the weapon Darius had levelled an entire battlefield to accommodate, achieved almost nothing. It was a perfect illustration of the difference between a weapon that is frightening and a weapon that is effective, two categories that overlap far less often than generals tend to hope. Then came the decisive instant, the moment Alexander had been patiently engineering since the battle began. With the Persian centre stretched, distracted, and pulled out of shape by the cavalry struggle on the wing and the chaos of the failed chariot charge, the crucial gap yawned open right in front of the position where Darius stood. Alexander gathered his companion cavalry into the familiar wedge, and with the king himself at the point, drove it like a spearhead straight through the opening and directly toward the great king. The shock cavalry tore into the heart of the Persian army, smashing through the royal guard and bearing down on Darius himself, and the sight of the enemy king cutting his way toward him was more than Darius could face for a second time. He fled. Again. Just as at the earlier battle, the great king turned and ran from the field, while large parts of his enormous army were still fighting, and once more the flight of the ruler proved fatal to the morale of his men. Word that Darius had abandoned the field spread through the Persian ranks, and the will to fight drained out of them. It is hard not to feel a certain sympathy for Darius here, caught yet again in the impossible position of a brave but outmatched man. But in the brutal arithmetic of ancient kingship, a king who runs twice has effectively announced that he can no longer protect his people, and an empire built on the prestige of its ruler cannot survive that announcement. The throne was crumbling beneath him with every stride his horse took away from the battlefield. But the battle was not yet won, because while Alexander had been busy breaking the centre and chasing Darius, a serious crisis had developed on the other side of the field. The cautious Parmenion, holding the left wing as always, had come under tremendous pressure from the powerful Persian cavalry opposite him, and his wing was in real danger of being overwhelmed and surrounded. In the swirling chaos, a body of enemy cavalry had even managed to punch clean through a gap that opened in the Macedonian line. Now, a smart commander in their position would have wheeled around to strike the rear of Alexander's army at its most vulnerable moment. These horsemen, however, chose instead to gallop straight to the Macedonian baggage camp to plunder it, and to try to free the Persian prisoners held there, which was a thoroughly human decision and a thoroughly disastrous one for their side. The second line of troops that Alexander had so wisely positioned in reserve turned about and dealt with these raiders exactly as the formation had been designed to do. The hollow box held. Parmenion, however, was still in genuine trouble, and he sent urgent messengers to Alexander begging for help as his wing teetered on the edge of collapse. This put Alexander in an agonizing position. He was on the verge of running down Darius himself and perhaps ending the war in a single afternoon. But if he ignored Parmenian's plea, half his army might be destroyed behind him. To his credit, he made the right choice. He broke off the thrilling pursuit of the fleeing great king, wheeled his cavalry around and charged back across the field to rescue his struggling left wing. What followed was reportedly the bloodiest and most desperate fighting of the entire day, as Alexander's returning companions slammed into masses of Persian and allied cavalry who were themselves trying to flee the collapsing battle, resulting in a savage close-quarters clash. The arrival of the king turned the tide, the pressure on Parmenion eased, and the last organised resistance on the Persian side dissolved. This rescue, incidentally, became a subtle point of friction in how the battle was later remembered. Some accounts, shaped by people who were no friends of the old general, suggested that Parmenion had been sluggish and overly cautious, and that his slowness had robbed Alexander of the chance to capture Darius on the spot. Whether or not that was fair, the seed of resentment between the bold young king and his careful senior commander was being quietly watered, and it is worth keeping in mind because that relationship was heading somewhere very dark. For the moment, though, the two of them had together won the most important battle of the age. The plain of Gaugamela was littered with the wreckage of the largest army the Persian Empire could field, and that empire, as a functioning power, had effectively ceased to exist in the space of a single day. In the aftermath, the contrast in casualties told the whole story once again. The fleeing Persian host suffered enormous losses, particularly in the deadly chaos of the rout, while Alexander's disciplined and well-handled army came through with remarkably light losses by comparison, a testament to the fact that battles in this era were rarely decided by the killing during the fighting, but by the slaughter that followed once one side broke and ran. Alexander pushed the pursuit hard, driving his exhausted cavalry through the night in a relentless effort to run down the fugitives and above all to catch Darius, though the great king once again managed to stay just ahead of his pursuers and slip away into the darkness toward the eastern mountains. In the wake of the victory, Alexander was hailed in the grandest terms the conquered world could offer, acclaimed as the King of Asia, the master of the empire he had just shattered, a title that a few years earlier would have seemed the fever dream of an overambitious boy, and now read simply as a statement of fact. The scale of what Alexander had just accomplished is difficult to overstate. With this victory, the heartland of the greatest empire the world had ever known lay open before him, its central treasuries and ancient capital cities suddenly defenceless, its king a fugitive racing toward the distant eastern provinces with the remnants of his court. Alexander was no longer an invader nibbling at the edges of Persia. He was, for all practical purposes, the new master of Asia, and the great cities of the empire now began to fall into his hands one after another, like a series of doors swinging open down a long corridor. The first and grandest of these was Babylon, one of the oldest and most famous cities on earth, a place of legendary walls, soaring temples, and immense wealth. Rather than resist, the city threw open its gates and welcomed Alexander with what amounted to a festival, the inhabitants lining the streets, scattering flowers, and treating him as a deliverer. The local officials handed over the city and its riches without a fight, which was an exceedingly sensible move given the alternative. Alexander, once again playing the role of the respectful liberator rather than the foreign conqueror, made a great show of honouring the city's ancient gods and traditions, even ordering the restoration of a great temple that had fallen into disrepair under previous rulers. He let his weary army rest in the luxurious city for a time, a well-earned break after years of relentless campaigning, though one suspects the soldiers needed little encouragement to enjoy the comforts of the most sophisticated city most of them had ever seen. It was here, too, that Alexander began a policy that would define and complicate the rest of his reign. Rather than sweeping away the entire Persian governing class, he started keeping capable Persian officials in their posts, including, remarkably, a senior Persian commander who had actually fought against him at Gaugamela and then come over to his side, whom Alexander rewarded with the governorship of Babylon itself. The logic was sound. An empire this enormous simply could not be run by a few thousand Macedonians who did not speak the languages or understand the local systems, so the men who already knew how to administer these provinces were too valuable to discard out of spite. It was the pragmatic decision of a ruler who now thought of himself less as a foreign conqueror and more as the legitimate successor to the Persian throne, the new lord of Asia inheriting a going concern. To his Macedonian veterans, however, watching their king hand power and honours to the very people they had crossed the world to defeat, this policy looked increasingly strange and unwelcome, and it planted the seeds of a resentment that would grow into something serious. For now, it was simply good governance, and the army was too busy enjoying Babylon to grumble much. From Babylon he moved on to Susa, another of the great administrative capitals, which likewise surrendered without resistance, and handed over a treasury so vast that it almost defies belief. The accumulated wealth of generations of Persian kings, hoarded in the vaults of the city, now fell into Alexander's hands, an amount of gold and silver so enormous that it took a great train of pack animals to move it. This was no longer the windfall of a single captured baggage train. This was the financial bloodstream of an entire empire, and it made Alexander almost overnight the richest man in the world by a margin that would have been comical if it were not so consequential. Among the treasures at Susa, he is said to have found certain statues that the Persians had carried off from Athens during their invasion of Greece long before, and he made a point of sending them back home, a gesture that fit neatly with the story of vengeance and liberation that had justified the whole campaign from the start. Susa also produced a small, oddly touching scene that captured the strangeness of his new position. When Alexander seated himself upon the great high throne of the Persian kings beneath its golden canopy, it turned out that the throne had been built for a taller man, and the young king's feet dangled well short of the royal footstool meant to support them. One of the attendants quickly slid a low table beneath his feet so he could sit in comfort. An elderly Persian servant who had spent his life in the royal household reportedly burst into tears at the sight, and when asked why, explained that the very table now serving as Alexander's footstool had once been the table at which the great King Darius dined. The casual repurposing of a sacred royal object as a footrest struck the old man as a vivid symbol of how far his world had fallen. Alexander, rather than dismissing the sentiment, is said to have been thoughtful about it, an early sign that he was beginning to feel the weight of stepping into another people's ancient dignity rather than simply trampling it. Not every door swung open quietly, however. As Alexander pushed on toward the ceremonial heart of the empire, he ran into a stubborn obstacle at a narrow mountain pass known as the Persian Gates, where a determined Persian commander had fortified the route with a strong force and was waiting for him. When Alexander tried to force his way through, he was met with a hail of rocks and missiles from the heights above and was thrown back with losses, one of the very few times in his entire career that he was decisively repulsed in a direct attack. It was, in a neat historical irony, very much like the famous stand the Greeks had once made against a Persian invasion at a similar mountain pass generations earlier, only with the roles reversed, the Persians now playing the heroic defenders of the narrow gap. Alexander, however, was not about to be stopped by a mountain. He found a local who knew the rough country, and using that guide he led a force along a difficult hidden path through the mountains, came around behind the defenders, and fell upon them from the rear at dawn. This was no gentle stroll. It was the dead of winter in high country, and the detour took his men on a brutal night march through snow and freezing cold, along treacherous mountain tracks, the kind of journey that would have been impossible for the heavy infantry, and that played directly to the strengths of his tough light troops and elite shield-bearers. They pushed through the misery in silence, and arrived behind the unsuspecting defenders exactly as planned. Trapped between the surprise attack from behind and his main force pushing through the front, the defence collapsed. The trick of the outflanking mountain path once used against the Greeks had now been turned around and used by a Greek-led army against the Persians, which is the sort of historical symmetry that makes you suspect the universe enjoys a good callback. The brave commander who had held the pass and inflicted on Alexander one of his rare bloody noses had earned a place in the story as the last Persian to seriously slow the conqueror down, a small but genuine moment of defiance in an otherwise unbroken run of disasters for the empire. With the Persian gates forced, the road lay open to the prize at the centre of it all, the city of Persepolis, the ceremonial and spiritual capital of the Persian Empire. This was not merely another rich administrative centre, it was the symbolic heart of Persian royal power, a magnificent complex of palaces, halls and monuments built by generations of great kings to glorify their dynasty. decorated with grand staircases carved with images of the many peoples of the empire bringing tribute to the throne. It was, in short, the single most potent symbol of everything Alexander had set out to conquer, and it now belonged to him, along with yet another colossal treasury that further swelled his already absurd fortune. The riches stored at Persepolis reportedly dwarfed even the staggering hoards taken elsewhere. The saved-up tribute of an entire continent gathered over 2 centuries into one place, and moving it all required a baggage train of almost comic proportions, with thousands of pack animals and camels pressed into service to haul the gold and silver away. Alexander lingered in the region for several months over the winter, resting his army amid the splendour of the palace city while he considered his next move. He walked the grand processional staircases lined with stone carvings showing delegations from every nation of the empire filing forward to present their gifts to the throne, a frozen parade of subject peoples that must have impressed even a man who had now personally conquered most of them. He even, by one famous account, came across a fallen statue of a great earlier Persian king toppled on the ground, and paused to reflect on the rise and fall of the mighty, which is the kind of thoughtful moment that tends to get recorded when the man having it is about to do something far less reflective. Because shortly afterward, Alexander did something that has been argued about ever since. He burned it. The great palace complex of Persepolis, the irreplaceable ceremonial heart of the ancient empire, was set ablaze and largely destroyed by fire. The question of why has occupied historians for over 2,000 years, and the ancient sources offer 2 rather different explanations, which may both contain some truth. One version paints it as a calculated political act, the deliberate and symbolic conclusion of the Great War of Vengeance that had supposedly motivated the entire campaign. Generations earlier, a Persian army had invaded Greece and burned the sacred temples of Athens, and the official purpose of Alexander's expedition had always been framed as payback for that ancient outrage. Burning the Persian royal palace was, by this reading, the dramatic settling of that old score, a message to the Greek world that the debt had finally been paid in full and the war was over. The other, more colourful version tells of a drunken feast in the great palace, where the wine flowed freely and a persuasive companion, said in some accounts to be a courtesan from Athens, urged the king and his revellers on, suggesting that it would be a fitting and glorious thing to burn the palace of the enemy in revenge for what the Persians had done to her homeland. Caught up in the heat of the moment and the fumes of the celebration, Alexander supposedly seized a torch himself and led the way, with the whole drunken party following along, turning the destruction into a kind of riotous, fiery party trick. There is even a tradition that Alexander came to regret the act once he had sobered up and surveyed the smoking ruins of one of the wonders of the world. Whether it was cold political theatre or a wild act of drunken impulse, or some combination of the 2, the result was the same. The proud heart of the Persian Empire went up in flames, and with it went the last symbolic vestige of the old order. In a sense, the fire marked a turning point that went beyond the destruction of a building, because once the Great War of Vengeance had been symbolically concluded, the official reason for the entire campaign no longer existed. From this point on, Alexander was no longer fighting to avenge old Greek grievances against Persia. He was fighting purely to conquer, to push on for the sake of pushing on, and some of his soldiers, watching the smoke rise over the ruined palace, may well have wondered when, if ever, this remarkable adventure was going to end. The dynasty that had ruled Asia for 2 centuries was finished, its capitals taken, its treasures seized, and its monument to its own greatness reduced to charred stone. Yet for all the completeness of the victory, one crucial thing was still missing, and its absence gnawed at Alexander. Darius himself was still alive and still free, fleeing eastward with a dwindling band of followers, and as long as the great king lived, there remained, at least in theory, a rival around whom Persian resistance might one day rally. Alexander could occupy every palace and seize every treasury, but he could not truly call himself the legitimate ruler of the empire while its former king roamed the eastern provinces, however powerless he had become. And so, having shattered the Persian army, burned its ceremonial capital, and made himself the richest man alive, Alexander turned his restless attention to the one prize that had so far slipped through his fingers. The chase was on, and it would carry him further east than any Greek had ever gone, into a long and strange chapter that would change not only the map but the man himself. The chase that followed was relentless, and it pushed Alexander and his men to the very edge of endurance. Determined to capture the fleeing great king before he could rally fresh forces in the distant eastern provinces, Alexander drove his fastest troops forward in a brutal, headlong pursuit, riding through scorching heat and covering enormous distances at a punishing pace, sometimes leaving the slower parts of his army far behind. The final stretch became almost a contest of pure stubbornness against physical limits. By some accounts, the closing dash was so frantic that horses dropped dead from exhaustion beneath their riders. Men collapsed along the route, and Alexander pressed on through the night with only a small, hand-picked band of those still able to keep up, willing to risk arriving with a handful of followers rather than let his quarry slip away. It was the kind of effort that would have killed an ordinary man and very nearly killed a good number of his soldiers, all in pursuit of a prize that, as it turned out, was about to be snatched away from him by other hands entirely. He was so close to his prize that he could almost taste it. But Darius, it turned out, was no longer a free man even among his own followers. The senior nobles accompanying him, led by a powerful provincial governor named Bessus, who commanded the eastern territories, had concluded that their king was a liability who kept losing, and that their best hope of survival, or perhaps of seizing power for themselves, lay in taking matters into their own hands. So they betrayed him. The conspirators seized Darius, bound him, and dragged him along as a prisoner while they fled. And then, as Alexander's relentless pursuit finally began to close the gap, they made their final decision. Rather than hand over a living great king to the conqueror, the plotters struck Darius down and abandoned him by the roadside, leaving him mortally wounded as they scattered to save themselves. By the time the first Macedonians reached the spot, the great king of Persia, the man Alexander had chased across half a world and beaten in 2 enormous battles, was already dead or dying, killed not by his enemy, but by his own people. According to the stories that grew up around the moment, a Macedonian soldier came upon the dying king and gave him water, and Darius spent his final breath expressing a kind of grim gratitude that it was at least an honourable enemy and not his own treacherous followers who would find him. Whether or not those touching last words are real, the bare fact remains. The reign of the Persian royal house ended in a ditch at the hands of its own servants. Alexander, arriving too late to capture his rival alive, reacted in a way that revealed exactly how he wanted this whole story to be understood. He was reportedly genuinely moved by the sight of his fallen adversary, and he draped his own royal cloak over the body as a mark of respect. More importantly, he arranged for Darius to receive a magnificent royal funeral with full honours, sending the body to be buried among the tombs of the Persian kings. This was not sentimentality, or not only sentimentality, it was brilliant political theatre. By honouring Darius as a king, and treating his murder as the monstrous crime of regicide, Alexander positioned himself not as the foreign invader who had destroyed the Persian Empire, but as the rightful successor and avenger of the murdered great king, the legitimate heir who would now hunt down the traitors who had dared to lay hands on their lawful sovereign. It was a remarkable piece of reframing, transforming the man who had spent years trying to kill Darius into the chief mourner at his graveside. The murderers had, without meaning to, handed Alexander the perfect excuse to keep marching east, now wearing the respectable cloak of justice rather than the bloody one of conquest. The genuineness of at least part of this is suggested by the strange and rather moving relationship that had developed between Alexander and the captured family of Darius, who had remained in his keeping with their dignity intact, as recounted earlier. The elderly mother of Darius in particular is said to have come, over the years of her honoured captivity, to regard Alexander with something close to maternal affection, and to have grieved deeply when he eventually died, despite his being the man who had destroyed her son and her dynasty. It is one of the odder human footnotes of the whole saga, a conquered queen mourning her conqueror as though he were her own child, and it hints that Alexander's chivalry toward the royal women, whatever its political uses, was not entirely an act. He could order the cold-blooded killing of a loyal old general and weep over the corpse of his enemy in the same chapter of his life, which is as good a summary as any of just how difficult a man he was to pin down. That excuse mattered, because the official reason for the entire war had just expired. The grand expedition, as established, had always been sold to the Greek world as a war of vengeance against Persia, and with the Persian king dead and his capitals burned, that war was, by any honest accounting, over and won. Alexander acknowledged this in a very practical way. He released the contingents of allied Greek soldiers who who had joined the campaign under that banner, thanking them, rewarding them generously, and giving them leave to go home to Greece, their mission accomplished. It was a clean and honourable conclusion to the official war. Many of these men, however, having grown accustomed to the wealth and excitement of the campaign, promptly turned around and signed up again as ordinary paid soldiers, because a steady wage from the richest man in the world was rather more appealing than returning to a quiet farm. The symbolism, though, was unmistakable. From this point forward, the Greeks were no longer fighting a shared national war of liberation. Alexander was simply continuing east because he wanted to, because the conquering had become its own purpose, and the new chief enemy was the usurper Bessus, who had now thrown off all pretense and declared himself the new great king under a grand old royal name, setting up a centre of resistance in the rugged eastern lands. In doing so, Bessus had unwittingly cast himself in the role Alexander most wanted his enemies to play, that of the illegitimate pretender and royal murderer, against whom Alexander could march as the rightful avenger of the murdered Darius. It was a part Bessus would come to regret accepting, though that reckoning belonged to the Eastern campaign still to come. It is around this point in the story that something begins to change, and the change is subtle at first, and then increasingly impossible to ignore. The brilliant, charismatic young king who had inspired such devotion in his men began, slowly, to transform into someone his oldest companions found harder and harder to recognize. The root of the problem was a genuine and almost impossible dilemma. Alexander now ruled an empire of millions of Persians and other Asian peoples who had their own deeply rooted ideas about what a proper ruler should be. To them, a king was a remote and magnificent figure, surrounded by elaborate ceremony, robed in splendour, approached with reverence. He was emphatically not a rough soldier, who drank and joked with his men as one comrade among many. If Alexander wanted his new subjects to accept him as their legitimate sovereign, rather than as a barbarian warlord squatting on their throne, he had to start looking and behaving like the kind of king they expected. So he did. Alexander began to adopt elements of Persian royal dress and court custom, blending them, at least at first, with his Macedonian style into a kind of hybrid, taking on the trappings and ceremonies of the great kings he had overthrown. From a coldly political standpoint, this was perfectly sensible. You cannot govern an ancient empire by ignoring everything its people consider essential to legitimate rule. But to his Macedonian soldiers and noblemen, this was something close to a betrayal. They had crossed the world following a Macedonian king, and they saw themselves not as grovelling subjects but as free fighting men, the comrades and equals of a leader who was simply the first among them. When that leader began dressing in the manner of the defeated enemy and surrounding himself with foreign ceremony, they regarded it with disgust, muttering that their king was going soft, adopting the decadent and unmanly customs of the very people they had conquered. To the proud, plain-spoken Macedonians, all this Eastern finery and elaborate court etiquette looked like weakness and corruption, and the sight of their hard-bitten warrior king playing the part of an Oriental monarch sat very badly indeed. Alexander, in essence, was trying to please two completely incompatible audiences at the same time, which is a strategy roughly as doomed as it sounds. The transformation went beyond clothing into the whole texture of his court. He began to surround himself with an increasingly elaborate apparatus of ceremony, ushers and chamberlains and attendants drawn partly from the Persian nobility, the kind of formal magnificence that the old great kings had used to set themselves apart from ordinary mortals. Access to the king grew more controlled, the easy informality of the early years giving way to protocol and distance. To his mother Olympias, far away in Greece, and never shy with her opinions, much of this was a source of anxiety, and she reportedly bombarded her son with letters warning him not to trust this general or that official, and fretting over the influence others held at his court. Whether her warnings sharpened his suspicions or merely echoed them is hard to say, but the overall effect was a king who was simultaneously more exalted and more alone than he had ever been, raised so far above his companions that there was scarcely anyone left who could speak to him as an equal, and fewer still who dared to. Greatness, it turns out, can be a remarkably isolating condition, particularly when disagreeing with the great man has started to carry fatal risks. The growing tension between the king and his own people did not stay confined to grumbling about wardrobe choices. It curdled into something far more dangerous, beginning with a dark affair that destroyed one of the most senior families in the army. The man at the centre of it was Philotas, the commander of the elite companion cavalry, and the son of none other than the venerable old general Parmenion, the steady veteran who had served Alexander's father and held the line in every great battle, as discussed. Philotas was a capable officer, but he was also proud and boastful, a man who had made enemies through his arrogance, and who had reportedly been heard complaining that Alexander was getting altogether too grand and taking too much credit for victories that depended on the whole army. A plot against Alexander's life was uncovered, a scheme by some lesser figures to assassinate the king. The damning detail was that Philotas had apparently been told about the plot beforehand and had failed to report it, dismissing the warning as unimportant. Whether this made him a genuine conspirator or merely a careless man who badly underestimated a threat is something historians still debate, and the truth may simply be that Philotas was disliked and convenient. What is certain is that his many enemies seized the opportunity to destroy him. He was arrested and brought before an assembly of the Macedonian soldiers, accused of treason, and under harsh interrogation he was made to confess, though confessions extracted that way have always been worth precisely nothing, since a man in such circumstances will say whatever he believes his tormentors wish to hear. Condemned, Philotas was put to death. There was an old tradition behind that public trial, and it is worth understanding because it makes what followed even darker. In the Macedonian way, a king could not simply order the death of a nobleman on his own authority. Capital charges against a free Macedonian were supposed to be judged by an assembly of the army, the soldiers themselves acting as a kind of jury, a custom that reflected the old idea, mentioned earlier, that the king ruled over free comrades rather than cowering subjects. So Philotas was given his trial before the troops, at least in form, which lent the proceedings a veneer of lawful justice. The trouble was that an assembly of soldiers, worked up by accusations of a plot against the king they followed, was hardly a cool and impartial court, and the outcome was never really in doubt. The forms of the old freedoms were being preserved on the surface, even as the substance of them was quietly bleeding away. And here the logic of absolute power turned genuinely chilling. With Philotas executed for treason, his father Parmenion became an intolerable danger, through no fault of his own. The old general, now elderly, was stationed far away guarding the empire's treasure and the vital supply lines with a large army that was intensely loyal to him personally. A grieving father, in command of a powerful force sitting directly astride Alexander's lifeline, who had just learned that the king had executed his son, was a threat that simply could not be allowed to exist. So Alexander made a cold and terrible calculation. He sent fast riders racing ahead with secret orders, and the loyal old soldier who had anchored the army through every crisis of the campaign was killed on his king's command before he could even be told that his son was dead, let alone have the chance to react. It was a brutal piece of preemptive politics, the kind of thing that keeps a throne secure at the cost of everything that makes it worth sitting on. The man who had given his caution, his experience, and decades of faithful service was disposed of as a mere security risk, and the message it sent through the army was unmistakable and frightening. No record of loyalty, however long, would protect anyone if the king decided they had become inconvenient. Alexander drew a careful lesson from the whole affair, and it was a revealing one. When it came time to fill the vacant command of the elite companion cavalry that Philotas had held, he deliberately did not give it to a single man. Instead, he split the command in two, dividing the prestigious unit between two trusted officers so that never again would one individual control so powerful and concentrated a body of troops, the kind of force that could make its commander a genuine rival. It was a small administrative decision that spoke volumes about the king's new frame of mind. He was now thinking constantly about who might threaten him and how to make sure no single subordinate ever grew too strong. The affair also gave him the cover to quietly remove several other men he had come to distrust, folding their disappearance into the general atmosphere of suspicion. A court that runs on fear has a way of expanding the list of the fearful, and Alexander's was beginning to do exactly that. If the death of Parmenion was the cold cruelty of calculated politics, what happened at a feast in a city far to the east was something different and, in its way, even more disturbing, because it was not planned at all. It was raw, drunken and human, and it cost the life of one of the men Alexander owed the most. The Macedonians were famous, even notorious for their drinking, and the royal feasts were marathon affairs of heavy competitive wine consumption that frequently slid from celebration into ugliness, a cultural habit that the more restrained Greeks of the south found both shocking and a little appalling. Mixing that much wine with the simmering tensions over the king's new ways and the dangerous flattery of ambitious courtiers was, in retrospect, a recipe for catastrophe, and on this particular evening the pot finally boiled over. The setting was one such banquet. The wine was flowing as it always did at these long drinking parties, and the conversation turned, as it increasingly did, to flattery of the king. Some of the courtiers began praising Alexander's deeds in extravagant terms, exalting him above the heroes of old and even above his own father, and belittling the achievements of the older generation of Macedonian veterans who had built the kingdom under Philip. This was more than one old soldier present could stomach. Cleitus the Black, the grizzled cavalry officer who, as established earlier, had saved Alexander's life in that first desperate battle at the river by striking down an enemy about to deliver a killing blow, was drunk and deeply offended. He spoke up bluntly in defence of Philip and the old guard, mocking the fawning flatterers, criticising Alexander's adoption of foreign ways and his swelling arrogance, and in the heat of his anger, pointedly reminding the king to whom he owed his very life. It was a dangerous thing to say to a proud and increasingly volatile ruler, especially with both men deep in their cups. The argument escalated, voices rose, friends tried to pull Cleitus away and calm the situation, but neither man would back down. And then, in a flash of drunken rage that he would regret for the rest of his days, Alexander seized a weapon and struck his old friend down, killing on the spot the very man who had once saved him. The aftermath was as wrenching as the act itself. The instant the rage drained away and Alexander understood what he had done, he was utterly devastated. He had killed Cleitus the Black, a loyal friend, a brave officer, and the man to whom he literally owed his survival, over nothing more than drunken words at a party. Overcome with horror and grief, Alexander was inconsolable, and the accounts describe him collapsing into a profound despair, shutting himself away, refusing food and comfort for days, tormented by what his own uncontrolled fury had cost. It took the combined efforts of his companions and advisers, who reassured him through various arguments that what was done could not be undone, and that he must not destroy himself with grief, to eventually bring him back to his duties. The episode is one of the darkest in his entire life, and it stands as a grim lesson about the toxic combination of unchecked power, heavy drinking, relentless flattery, and a temper that had never truly been tamed. The same fierce, all-consuming nature that made him an unstoppable conqueror also made him capable of murdering a beloved friend in a single unguarded moment, and no amount of later remorse could bring Cleitus back. His companions eventually persuaded him, through philosophy and reassurance, that a king must not be consumed by guilt, but the wound stayed with him, one more shadow added to a soul that was collecting them at an alarming rate. The clash between the Macedonian way and the Persian way came to a head again, this time over a matter of ceremony that seemed small on the surface, but struck at something deep. Alexander wished to introduce at his court a Persian custom, in which those approaching the king would perform a gesture of respect, a kind of bow or prostration that the Persians had always offered to their great kings as ordinary courtly etiquette. To the Persians this was simply good manners, the proper way to address a sovereign, carrying no religious meaning whatsoever. To the Greeks and Macedonians, however, it meant something else entirely and intolerable. In their world, you bowed down and prostrated yourself only before the gods. To perform such a gesture before a mere mortal man, even a king, was degrading and almost blasphemous, the act of a slave rather than a free man. Asking proud Macedonian noblemen to grovel on the floor before Alexander as though he were a deity was to them an outrage. Alexander, whose growing belief in his own special semi-divine nature has already been touched upon, tried to push the custom through anyway, reportedly arranging an occasion at which his guests would each perform the gesture, and in return receive a friendly kiss from the king, a way of easing the practice in gently. The plan ran straight into determined resistance, and the most prominent objector was a figure who deserves special mention. The official historian travelling with the expedition, a scholarly man named Callisthenes, who happened to be a relative of Alexander's old tutor Aristotle, and had been brought along in part because of that connection, flatly refused to debase himself in this manner. In fairness to the complicated truth, Callisthenes was no straightforward saint of free speech. Earlier in the campaign, he had been one of the more enthusiastic singers of Alexander's praises, penning glowing accounts of the king's glory, and his abrupt swing toward rigid public disapproval struck some as the posturing of a self-righteous man who enjoyed an audience. He was, by various accounts, proud, tactless, and not especially likeable, the sort of intellectual who lectures a room and mistakes stubbornness for principle, none of which meant he was wrong about the bowing, only that he made an inconvenient martyr and an easy target. By one famous account he approached the king without performing the gesture, and, when this was noticed, was denied the customary kiss, whereupon he remarked dryly that he would simply go away the poorer by one kiss, a piece of cool defiance that delighted the watching Macedonians and infuriated the king. Before that moment Callisthenes had reportedly made the principled case aloud, arguing that there must be a clear line between the honours owed to gods and the honours owed to men, that prostration belonged to the worship of the divine, and that to blur the two would not exalt Alexander but cheapen the very distinction that made any honour meaningful. It was a genuinely thoughtful objection, rooted in the Greek horror of treating a living man as a god, and it had the considerable disadvantage of being aimed squarely at a king who was increasingly fond of the idea that he might be exactly that. The whole experiment was so awkward and so resented that Alexander was forced to quietly abandon it. But he did not forget who had made him look foolish. That resentment found its outlet not long afterward in a genuinely sinister episode involving the corps of royal pages, the noble youths who attended the king and guarded him, the same institution of aristocratic young men in royal service that had shaped Alexander himself in his own youth, as described much earlier. A group of these pages, nursing a personal grievance after one of their number, felt he had been harshly and humiliatingly punished, hatched a plot to murder the king in his sleep. The conspiracy was discovered before it could be carried out, by a stroke of luck involving the king happening to stay up drinking all night, on the very evening the attempt was planned, and the young plotters were arrested and put to death. The fatal complication for Callisthenes was that, as the tutor and intellectual influence of these very pages, he fell under suspicion of having encouraged or inspired their treasonous thinking with his outspoken talk of freedom and his open contempt for the king's pretensions. Whether he was actually involved in the plot or simply a convenient scapegoat, whom Alexander was already eager to be rid of after the bowing fiasco, is impossible to know for certain, and the sources themselves disagree. What is clear is that the historian was arrested and did not survive his imprisonment, dying in custody under circumstances that did Alexander no credit. His death sent a chill through the educated Greeks who had accompanied the expedition, and badly damaged Alexander's standing among the philosophers and intellectuals back home, including, one imagines, his old teacher Aristotle, who could hardly have been pleased to learn that his relative had perished at the hands of his most famous former student. The lesson, once again, was brutally plain. Open criticism of the king, however principled, had become a fatal occupation. Taken together, this run of dark events marks the great turning point in Alexander's story, the moment when the dazzling hero of the early campaigns begins to curdle into something more troubling. The young man who had been described as fiercely competitive and unable to tolerate coming in second, as noted at the very beginning of his story, had now achieved a level of absolute power that no check or balance could restrain, and the results were exactly what an honest observer of human nature might predict. Surrounded by flatterers who told him only what he wished to hear, increasingly convinced of his own superhuman destiny, exhausted by endless years of campaigning, and frequently deep in his cups, he grew suspicious, isolated, and dangerous. The easy comradeship between the king and his men, once the secret strength of the whole enterprise, was being replaced by fear. The free-speaking Macedonian nobles, who had always considered themselves entitled to argue with their king and tell him hard truths, were learning, one painful example at a time, that doing so could now get them killed. The contrast with the younger Alexander is almost painful to consider. This was, after all, the same man who in his early campaigns had walked among his wounded soldiers, listening patiently to each one recount his part in the battle, who had buried his fallen with honour and looked after the families they left behind, building the fierce loyalty that carried him across the world. The leader who had once won hearts by sharing every hardship and treating his men as comrades was now the leader who executed loyal officers, killed a friend in a drunken fury, and silenced critics in his prison. The qualities had not so much vanished as soured, the intense personal bonds turning into intense personal suspicion, the passion that once inspired devotion now just as capable of inspiring dread. Power had not given Alexander a new personality, so much as it had removed every restraint from the one he always had, and the results were not pretty to watch. It would be unfair, though, to reduce all of this to a simple tale of a good man corrupted by power, satisfying as that story is. There is a more sympathetic reading, and it is probably closer to the truth. Alexander was attempting something genuinely unprecedented and almost impossibly difficult. He was trying to fuse two utterly different worlds, to rule as both a Macedonian war leader and a Persian great king at the same time, to weld the conquerors and the conquered into a single functioning empire under one crown. This was a visionary ambition, far ahead of its time, and arguably the only way such a vast and varied realm could ever have held together. Most conquerors throughout history have simply planted their own people on top of the conquered as a ruling caste and called it a day, which tends to produce resentment that festers for generations. Alexander was reaching towards something more ambitious and, in its way, more generous. A partnership in which the talents of the conquered would be folded into the new order rather than merely exploited, in which a Persian nobleman might serve and a Macedonian soldier might settle, and the two worlds might gradually become one. Whether this sprang from genuine idealism, hard-headed pragmatism, or his own swelling sense of being a ruler above all narrow tribal loyalties, is impossible to disentangle, and was probably all three at once. But it required him to be different and even contradictory things to different peoples, and it asked his fiercely proud Macedonian followers to swallow changes they found humiliating and unnatural. The strain of straddling that impossible divide, layered on top of the corrosive effects of absolute power, constant danger, heavy drinking, and being treated by millions as something more than human, was enough to break the bonds of trust and even the temperament of a man who had once seemed invincible in every sense. He was not simply a hero turned villain. He was a visionary attempting the impossible and paying the personal price for it, growing ever more isolated even as his empire grew ever larger. And yet, for all the darkness gathering around the throne, the restless engine that drove him had not slowed for an instant. The usurper Bessus was still out there in the wild eastern lands, styling himself the new great king and offering a rallying point for resistance. And beyond him lay provinces no Greek army had ever seen, and beyond those the legendary edge of the world itself, which the geographers of his day placed somewhere out in the mysterious east. These were not the rich, settled lands of the Persian heartland with their obliging cities and well-stocked treasuries. Ahead lay a punishing landscape of towering mountain ranges, scorching deserts, and freezing high country, inhabited by fierce, independent peoples who had never truly bowed to anyone and had no intention of starting now. It was terrain that mocked the very idea of a decisive battle, the kind of place where a conventional army could march for years and conquer nothing it could hold. Alexander, who could no more stop conquering than he could stop breathing, was about to plunge into the harshest and most frustrating phase of his entire campaign, a long grinding ordeal in rugged country against enemies who refused to fight the way he wanted them to, melting into the mountains the moment he brought his great army to bear, and reappearing behind him the moment he moved on. The man was changing, his closest bonds were fraying, but his hunger for the next horizon burned exactly as fiercely as it had on the day a tearful father told a boy on a black horse that Macedonia was too small for him. The first great obstacle of this new phase was not an army but a mountain range, one of the highest and most forbidding on earth. To get at the usurper Bessus, who had fled into the far northeastern provinces and declared himself the new great king, Alexander had to lead his army over the towering passes of an enormous mountain barrier, a crossing made in the teeth of cold, thin air, and a desperate shortage of food. The men chewed on whatever they could find and suffered terribly in the freezing heights, and the army that staggered down the far side was lean, frostbitten, and thoroughly miserable. There was, to put it mildly, no resupply station waiting at the top of the pass, no shelter from the biting wind, and certainly nothing resembling a warm meal. The soldiers reportedly survived on raw, or barely cooked provisions and whatever sparse local plants they could dig up, and many lost fingers and toes to the cold, or simply could not keep up and were lost along the brutal route. It was the kind of crossing that would be remembered as a legendary hardship by any other army in history, and for Alexander's veterans it was simply another mountain in another year of an endless campaign. But it had done the supposedly impossible yet again, appearing in Bessus's territory from a direction nobody had thought an army could come, which was rapidly becoming Alexander's signature move. Showing up where you're not supposed to be able to show up is, it turns out, an excellent way to win wars before the fighting even starts. Bessus discovered this the hard way. As Alexander descended into his lands, the usurper's support simply evaporated. The local lords who had backed him took one look at the approaching Macedonians and decided that their new self-proclaimed great king was not worth dying for, and in a moment of grim historical symmetry, they did to Bessus exactly what Bessus had done to Darius. They betrayed him, seized him, and handed him over to Alexander, the betrayer betrayed by the same kind of treachery he had used himself. There is a certain poetic tidiness to it that even the most serious historian can appreciate. Alexander, now firmly wearing his chosen role as the rightful avenger of the murdered Darius, dealt with Bessus harshly and publicly, having him punished in the traditional Persian manner reserved for regicides and usurpers before he was put to death. It was a brutal end, but it served Alexander's purposes perfectly, confirming to his Persian subjects that he was the legitimate sovereign who would avenge crimes against the throne, rather than just another opportunist who had grabbed it. The man who killed a king had himself been killed for it, by the very king the killing had been meant to please. The East, one imagines, took careful note. As he pushed deeper into these distant lands, Alexander indulged the habit that had become almost a personal tic by this point. He founded cities, and he founded a great many of them. Wherever he established a garrison to hold a strategic spot, he tended to plant a new settlement, populating it with a mix of aging or wounded veterans who could no longer keep up with the relentless campaigning, local inhabitants, and assorted camp followers, and then, displaying a level of creativity that suggests the well had run somewhat dry, he named the result after himself. By now there were Alexandria scattered all across the conquered world, to the point where a traveller could be forgiven for losing track of which Alexandria he was currently standing in. One of them, founded at a key crossroads in the south, survives to this day as a major city in Afghanistan. Another, planted at the very edge of his advance on the bank of a great river marking the frontier, he pointedly named the farthest Alexandria, a settlement meant to stand as the outermost marker of his conquests, the place where the empire stopped and the wild unknown began. These were not vanity projects, or not only vanity projects. They were deliberate instruments of control, anchors of Greek and Macedonian presence in foreign lands, and a surprising number of them grew into real and lasting cities, which is more than most conquerors can claim for their building programs. The men left behind to populate these distant outposts, however, were not always thrilled with the arrangement. Imagine being a Macedonian veteran who had marched and fought for years, dreaming of one day going home to a quiet farm in Greece, only to be informed that home was now a freshly built garrison town in the middle of a foreign land thousands of miles from anywhere you recognized, surrounded by people whose language you did not speak and whose food you did not trust, with no realistic prospect of ever seeing your old village again. Not exactly the triumphant homecoming most of them had pictured when they first crossed into Asia. The discontent of these stranded settlers would simmer quietly for years, and it was one more sign of a growing strain that ran beneath the surface of all the glory, the gap between what the conquest meant to Alexander and what it cost the ordinary men who made it possible. Beyond that frontier river roamed the nomadic horsemen of the steppe, a fast-moving people who fought from the saddle and who began to gather on the far bank, harassing the Macedonians and daring them to cross. They were the kind of enemy that conventional armies find maddening, here one moment and gone the next, with no cities to capture and no homeland to threaten. Alexander, who was nursing an injury at the time and had been warned by his own seers that the omens for crossing were unfavourable, decided to cross anyway, because being told he could not do something had never once worked as a deterrent. He got his men over the swift river on rafts and stuffed hides, the same improvised trick he had used to astonish an enemy years earlier. Only this time he added a modern touch, using his torsion artillery to hurl missiles across the water and clear the far bank of defenders before his troops landed. The startled nomads, who had never seen bolts and stones come flying at them from that kind of range, gave ground, and Alexander rode them down, pursuing them out into the parched steppe until the brutal heat and bad water did more damage to his own men than the enemy had. He won the engagement and proved that not even the elusive horsemen of the plains were beyond his reach, but it was a victory that conquered nothing he could actually hold, which was becoming the defining frustration of the entire region. That frustration deepened into the longest and most grinding ordeal of the whole campaign, because the local population rose against him in a sprawling guerrilla war that simply would not end. The resistance found a gifted leader, a local warlord who understood perfectly well that meeting Alexander in open battle was suicide, and who therefore refused to do any such thing. Instead, he waged a war of raids and ambushes, striking at isolated detachments and supply lines, stirring up the countryside, and then vanishing into the deserts and mountains with his swift nomad allies before the main Macedonian army could pin him down. On one occasion he lured a Macedonian column into a trap and destroyed it almost completely, one of the rare outright disasters Alexander's forces suffered, and a sharp reminder that all the tactical genius in the world struggles against an enemy who refuses to stand still and be brilliantly defeated. Alexander adapted as he always did, abandoning the idea of one grand decisive blow, and instead breaking his army into multiple fast-moving columns that fanned out across the vast territory to hunt the rebels relentlessly, garrisoning the land with a network of forts and grinding the resistance down through sheer persistence over roughly 2 exhausting years. It was patient, unglamorous, brutal work, the opposite of the lightning campaigns that had made his name, and it is striking how much of it would feel familiar to any modern army that has marched into these same unforgiving mountains and discovered that conquering the map is far easier than conquering the people on it. In the end, the guerrilla leader was undone not by Alexander but by his own allies, who, worn down by the unrelenting pressure and calculating that their own survival now lay in cutting their losses, turned on him and killed him. Treachery, it seems, was simply the regional currency, and Alexander had a remarkable run of enemies who were ultimately destroyed by their own side. This whole eastern phase marked a profound change in the texture of the campaign, one worth pausing on. In the west, against the Persian Empire, Alexander had fought a war of grand set-piece battles and falling capitals, the kind of clean, decisive victories that make for stirring stories and tidy maps. Beat the great king in the field, take his cities, claim his throne, and the empire was yours. Out here, in the endless mountains and deserts of the Far East, none of that logic applied. There was no single enemy to defeat, no capital whose capture ended the war, no throne that, once taken, made everyone obey. There were only countless fierce local peoples who had to be subdued one stubborn valley at a time, and who tended to rise up again the moment his back was turned. The dazzling conqueror of the earlier years was learning the oldest and most humbling lesson in the book, that winning battles and actually holding territory are 2 entirely different things, and that the second is far harder, far slower, and far less glorious than the first. The glory was draining out of the adventure, replaced by a grinding war of attrition, and the men felt the difference keenly, even if their tireless king refused to. It was during this long slog through the eastern lands that one of the campaign's most famous feats of daring took place, at a fortress so naturally strong that its defenders thought it could never fall. The stronghold sat atop a sheer, towering rock face, well stocked with provisions, and when Alexander demanded its surrender, the defenders laughed at him, and mockingly suggested that he had better find himself soldiers with wings, since only flying men could ever hope to reach them. This was, predictably, the worst possible thing to say to Alexander, who treated impossibility as a personal invitation. He called for volunteers with experience in climbing, offered enormous rewards to the first men to reach the top, and under cover of darkness a few hundred of them began scaling the icy, vertical cliff using iron tent pegs, driven into the frozen ground and crevices, with ropes to haul themselves up. It was appallingly dangerous, and a number of the climbers fell to their deaths in the dark, but by dawn the survivors had hauled themselves onto the heights directly above the fortress. When the defenders looked up and saw Macedonian soldiers standing on the supposedly unreachable summit above them, they were so stunned and demoralized, assuming a much larger force had somehow flown up the mountain in the night, that they lost all heart and surrendered. Alexander had in effect found his winged soldiers, and the lesson, as ever, was that telling this particular man something was impossible only guaranteed he would spend the next week proving you wrong. Among the captives taken at this and similar strongholds was a young noblewoman named Roxana, the daughter of a powerful local chieftain, celebrated by the sources for her great beauty. Alexander, who by various accounts was genuinely taken with her, married her, and the union was a great deal more than a romance. It was a calculated act of statecraft, a way of binding the fierce and fiercely independent nobility of these eastern lands to him through marriage rather than endless warfare, signalling that he intended to rule alongside the local elite rather than simply crush them. This fit neatly with his broader and increasingly controversial project of fusing the conquerors and the conquered, as discussed earlier, though it did little to please his Macedonian companions, who would have much preferred their king to marry a proper Macedonian bride rather than a daughter of the very people they had spent 2 miserable years fighting. To Alexander, however, the marriage was a tool of empire as much as a matter of the heart, and it helped finally settle the region enough that he could at last turn his restless gaze toward the prize that had been pulling at him all along, the mysterious lands to the southeast that the Greeks barely understood and that he believed lay near the very edge of the world. The wedding itself was staged with deliberate symbolism, celebrated according to local custom, in a way calculated to honour the traditions of his new in-laws and the eastern nobility he was trying to win over. The conquering king publicly embracing the ways of the conquered rather than imposing his own. To the grumbling Macedonians, it was one more uncomfortable example of their leader drifting ever further from the rough, comradely kingship they understood and into the role of a foreign-style monarch, but to the local lords it was a powerful gesture of inclusion, an unmistakable signal that submission to Alexander meant partnership rather than mere subjugation. Roxana herself would remain at his side through the rest of his travels, and her place in the story was far from over, though the most consequential chapter of her life still lay in the uncertain future. To reach them, Alexander recrossed the great mountains and descended toward the basin of a mighty river system in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. To the Greek imagination, this was a realm of legend and marvels, a distant land of fabulous riches, strange and enormous animals, naked wise men who sat in contemplation, and customs unlike anything in the Western world. More importantly, in the geography of the time, the Greeks believed that not far beyond these eastern rivers lay the great encircling ocean that they imagined wrapped around the entire landmass of the earth, the literal boundary of the world. For Alexander, who had been chasing glory and horizons since boyhood, and who increasingly saw himself as a figure of more than mortal destiny, reaching that world-encircling ocean became an irresistible obsession. To stand at the edge of the earth itself, where no conqueror had ever stood, was exactly the kind of impossible final achievement his entire nature demanded. The land also offered Alexander something his old tutor would have appreciated, a chance to indulge the genuine intellectual curiosity that had survived underneath all the conquering. He encountered groups of Indian holy men, ascetic philosophers who lived in extreme simplicity, owning nothing, wearing little or nothing, and spending their days in contemplation, and he was fascinated by them. When he sent messengers to summon some of these wise men to his presence, they reportedly responded with serene indifference, pointing out that a man who claimed to want wisdom should come to them rather than ordering them about like servants, and that all his conquest would in the end win him no more of the earth than the small plot required to bury him. It was the kind of cool, deflating reply that powerful men rarely hear and almost never enjoy, rather in the spirit of the famous philosopher who had once told the young Alexander to step out of his sunlight. To his credit, Alexander seems to have been intrigued rather than offended, and one of these sages eventually attached himself to the king's travelling court, a curious meeting of two utterly different ideas of how a person ought to live, the man who wanted everything and the man who wanted nothing, keeping company on the road. The lands he entered were not a single empire but a patchwork of rival kingdoms, tribes, and city-states, frequently at war with one another, which Alexander exploited with his usual political shrewdness. The powerful ruler of a great city in the region calculated that an alliance with the terrifying newcomer was far preferable to facing him as an enemy, particularly since it offered the delicious prospect of using Alexander's army against his own local rivals, chief among them a formidable king whose realm lay just across the next great river. So this ruler welcomed Alexander, supplied his army, and effectively pointed him at his enemies, which is a time-honoured way of dealing with an unstoppable foreign force, namely aiming it at the neighbour you already disliked. It was a shrewd bet, and it paid off for him in the short term, since Alexander was perfectly happy to fight the rival king across the river on his new ally's behalf. The deeper irony, which the local ruler may not have fully appreciated, was that inviting a conqueror of Alexander's appetite into your neighbourhood to settle a personal feud is rather like hiring a hurricane to clear your garden. It does indeed remove the weeds, along with the fence, the house, and most of the surrounding county. For the moment, though, the arrangement suited everyone except the king on the far bank, who now found the most dangerous soldier in the world marching toward him at the invitation of his oldest enemy. Not everyone was so accommodating. Several of the hill peoples and fortified towns resisted fiercely, and Alexander had to fight his way through a series of hard sieges and mountain assaults. One powerful stronghold put up a stubborn defence, and Alexander was wounded yet again in the fighting before it fell, adding to a collection of injuries that by now must have made his physicians despair of ever keeping their royal patient in one piece. He also made a point of capturing another towering rock fortress that local legend claimed had defied even one of the great heroes of Greek mythology in ages past. This, of course, made taking it utterly irresistible to Alexander, who had spent his whole life measuring himself against the heroes of old, and who was not about to let it be said that an ancient demigod had failed where he might succeed. The fortress crowned a massive height ringed by deep ravines, so that simply reaching the walls was a problem of engineering before it was ever a problem of fighting. Undeterred, Alexander set his men to the staggering task of building up an enormous earthwork ramp across the chasm, hauling and piling timber and earth day after day to bridge the gap and bring his artillery within range of the heights, a feat of sheer stubborn labour that gradually closed the impossible distance. He took the fortress, presumably with considerable satisfaction, the boy who had grown up idolising legendary warriors, now literally outdoing them on their own supposed turf. All of this, however, was merely the prelude to the great clash that would prove to be the most desperate and costly battle of his entire career, and his last major pitched battle. Across a wide, fast-flowing river swollen by the seasonal monsoon rains waited the formidable king, whose territory lay in the path of Alexander's advance, a ruler named Porus, who commanded a large and well-organised army and, crucially, a substantial force of war elephants. These were the very beasts the Macedonians had glimpsed and dreaded years before, but never truly had to fight in numbers, and now they would face them in earnest, hundreds of towering animals arrayed for battle, a living wall designed specifically to terrify horses and crush infantry. Porus stationed his army on the far bank and settled in to prevent Alexander from crossing, confident that the broad, rushing river and his elephant line made his position nearly unassailable. Alexander, faced with a river he could not cross directly because the enemy guarded every obvious ford, resorted once again to deception and patience rather than brute force. For days and nights on end he had his troops make noisy, threatening movements up and down the riverbank, marching about, raising clamour, and feinting as though to cross at this point or that, until the exhausted defenders, jumping at every false alarm, gradually grew numb to the commotion and stopped scrambling to respond to each one. Having lulled his enemy into treating the constant racket as background noise, Alexander then, during a wild night of thunder and pouring rain that masked his movements, secretly led a strong force of his best troops to a crossing point far upriver, leaving the rest of his army camped opposite Porus under a trusted senior officer, with strict instructions to hold the position as a decoy and only cross once the elephants had been drawn away from the bank. The storm worked entirely in Alexander's favour, the crash of thunder and the hiss of rain drowning out the noise of thousands of men and horses moving in the dark, though it also made the already dangerous crossing genuinely perilous. The crossing was treacherous, complicated by the storm and by an island midstream that left his men briefly wading through deeper water than expected, the current tugging at them in the darkness, but he got his strike force onto the far bank before Porus fully understood what was happening. The Indian king's response showed he was no fool. Realising too late that the main blow was coming from upstream, Porus first sent a force under his own son to contest the landing, but it arrived piecemeal and was beaten back, costing the prince his life. Then Porus committed his main army, drawing up his infantry behind a long line of war elephants spaced across his front like living towers, with cavalry and chariots on the wings, a formation specifically designed to shatter any frontal assault and to make Alexander's prized cavalry useless, since horses would not willingly charge into elephants. When Porus realised he had been outmanoeuvred and that Alexander himself was now across the river with a powerful force, he turned to meet this new threat, bringing up his main army and his dreaded elephants onto a stretch of firm ground. What followed was a savage, grinding fight unlike anything Alexander had faced before. The war elephants more than lived up to their fearsome reputation, ploughing into the Macedonian ranks, trampling men underfoot, and goring and flinging soldiers with their tusks and trunks, causing carnage and panic in a way that no cavalry charge ever had. The famous pike formation, so devastating against ordinary infantry, found itself in genuine trouble against these enormous, maddened beasts, and for a time the battle hung in a bloody and uncertain balance. It was, by every account, the hardest day of fighting Alexander ever experienced, the closest his run of victories ever came to disaster. But discipline and adaptability told in the end, as they so often had. The Macedonian infantry, recovering their nerve, learned on the spot to deal with the elephants by refusing to stand in solid blocks to be crushed, instead opening their ranks to let the beasts pass, swarming them from the sides, targeting the drivers who controlled them, and hacking and hurling javelins at the animals until many of them, wounded, exhausted and frenzied with pain, became as dangerous to their own side as to the enemy, wheeling about and trampling through the very ranks they were meant to protect. Meanwhile, Alexander used his superior cavalry to outmaneuver the Indian horse, concentrate his strength against the enemy wings, and gradually envelop Porus's army, hemming it in until the great Indian host was surrounded and broken. The victory was complete, but it had been bought at a terrible price, far higher than any of his earlier triumphs, and it left Alexander with no illusions about how much harder the fighting was becoming the farther east he pushed. What unsettled the army was not only the cost in lives, but what the battle seemed to promise about the road ahead. At every earlier stage, Alexander's victories had grown easier as the Persian Empire crumbled, but here, at the far eastern edge of everything, the resistance was getting fiercer, the weapons stranger, and the battles bloodier rather than the reverse. A single regional Indian king with a few dozen elephants had given them the hardest fight of the entire expedition. The soldiers were not mathematicians, but they could do this particular sum well enough, and the answer it produced was deeply discouraging. If this was merely the doorway to India, the veterans wanted no part of whatever lay in the rooms beyond. It was around this battle, too, that Alexander suffered a loss that was personal rather than strategic. His magnificent warhorse, the great black stallion he had tamed as a boy by understanding its fear of its own shadow, the loyal companion that had carried him across thousands of miles from his very first campaigns, finally died, worn out by age and the hardships of the long road, possibly hastened by wounds taken in the battle. The boy and the unridable horse had begun the whole story together, and now, at the far eastern edge of the known world, that chapter quietly closed. Grieving for his old friend, Alexander founded a city on the spot and named it in the horse's honour, a rare instance of one of his cities bearing a name other than his own, and a touching reminder that beneath the increasingly remote and god-haunted conqueror, there still beat the heart of the boy who had once loved a difficult horse that no one else could ride. The two of them had ridden together from a courtyard in Macedonia to the rivers of India, across more of the world than any Greek had ever seen, and it felt fitting, if painful, that the faithful old stallion's journey should end at the very edge of everything they had set out to conquer. There was one more remarkable note to the battle, and it concerned the defeated king himself. Porus had fought with tremendous courage throughout, leading from the back of the largest elephant and remaining on the field, wounded long after his cause was lost, refusing to flee in the manner of a certain other great king Alexander had chased across an empire. When this brave and battered ruler was finally brought before the conqueror and asked how he expected to be treated, Porus, with magnificent dignity, replied that he wished to be treated as a king. Alexander, who valued courage above almost any other quality, and was deeply impressed by his fallen opponent's bearing, did something that says a great deal about the chivalrous streak that still survived alongside his darker qualities. Far from punishing or humiliating Porus, he not only restored him to his kingdom but actually enlarged his territory, transforming a defeated enemy into a powerful and loyal ally. It was statesmanship of the highest order, and a reminder that for all the paranoia and violence that had crept into his later years, Alexander could still recognize and reward genuine greatness in another man, even one who had just cost him his bloodiest battle. With Porus subdued and now allied to him, the path to the east lay open, and Alexander's obsession burned hotter than ever. Somewhere beyond the next rivers, he was convinced, lay the great ocean that marked the boundary of the world, the ultimate destination that would crown his conquests with a glory no mortal had ever achieved. So he pressed on, pushing deeper into the river country of the region, crossing one swollen waterway after another, and bringing more local peoples under his sway, some by alliance, and some by hard fighting. But the conditions were turning against him in a way no enemy army ever had. The seasonal monsoon had arrived in full force, and for weeks on end the rains came down in relentless sheets, turning the ground to deep mud, rotting equipment and clothing, ruining food stores, and breeding disease among men who had grown up in the dry warmth of the Mediterranean and had never imagined that water could simply fall from the sky for months at a time. Snakes driven from their flooded burrows became a constant menace, and the soldiers, soaked, sick, and exhausted, began to lose what remained of their enthusiasm for finding the edge of the world. This was emphatically not the sun-drenched land of fabulous easy riches the storytellers back home had promised. What truly broke their spirit, though, was not the rain, but the rumours. As Alexander made plans to cross yet another great river and push on toward the ocean he was sure lay just ahead, word reached the army of what actually waited beyond. The lands further east, the soldiers learned, were not winding down toward some convenient world's edge, but opening into vast and populous kingdoms, ruled by mighty monarchs who could field armies far larger than anything they had yet faced, including, most alarmingly of all, war elephants numbered not in the hundreds, but in the thousands, having just survived the most brutal battle of their lives against a few dozen of the beasts. The prospect of marching into a land that counted its elephants by the thousand was, understandably, not an inspiring one. The men had followed Alexander to the literal limits of their map and beyond, but the map, it seemed, kept stretching, and the ocean he promised them never seemed to get any closer. He could practically feel it, just over the horizon, the end of the earth itself waiting to be reached. He was ready to march on, deeper into the unknown, chasing the edge of the map with the same hunger that had driven him since he was a boy. The trouble was that the men who had followed him every impossible step of the way were no longer so sure they wanted to find out what lay at the edge of the world, and the gap between what their king dreamed of and what his exhausted, homesick, rain-soaked soldiers were willing to endure was about to become the one obstacle that not even Alexander could simply outflank. That obstacle finally rose up at the bank of yet another great river, the easternmost point Alexander would ever reach, and it took a form no battlefield genius could overcome. His army simply stopped. After roughly 8 years of marching, fighting, freezing, baking, and bleeding, across the entire width of the known world, after thousands upon thousands of miles and more rivers and mountains and sieges than anyone could count, the men had reached the absolute limit of what they were willing to give. They had heard the rumours of what lay ahead, the vast kingdoms and the thousands of war elephants, and they had no desire whatsoever to find out whether the rumours were true. They wanted to go home, to see the wives and children and parents that some of them could barely remember while they were still alive to do it. And so, at the water's edge, they refused to take another step east. Alexander did what he always did when he wanted something. He tried to inspire them. He gathered his officers and delivered a stirring appeal, reminding them of everything they had achieved together, painting a glorious picture of the ocean that surely lay just beyond the horizon and the immortal fame that awaited them if they pressed on to the very edge of the earth. It was the kind of speech that had carried these men into a wall of pikes and across rivers under fire a dozen times before. This time it was met with silence, an uncomfortable, stubborn, exhausted silence. Finally, one of his most respected and senior officers found the courage to speak for the rank and file, and he did so with dignity rather than defiance, explaining plainly that the men were worn out, that they had followed their king to the ends of the earth and would have followed him further still if they had anything left to give, but that they simply had nothing left. It was not cowardice, it was the honest exhaustion of human beings who had given everything they had, and then some. Alexander, unaccustomed to hearing the word no from anyone, was furious. In a move that the boy who once slept with the poem of Achilles under his pillow would surely have recognized, he stormed off and shut himself away in his tent for several days, refusing to come out, evidently hoping that his sulking absence and the threat of his displeasure would shame the army into changing its mind, much as his great hero had once withdrawn in anger from his comrades. But the men, for all their love of him, did not budge. They had made their decision. At last Alexander gave way, and he did it in a manner that allowed him to save a little face, having the religious omens for crossing the river taken, whereupon they conveniently came back unfavourable, giving him a respectable excuse to announce that the gods themselves did not wish them to go on. When word spread that they were turning back, the soldiers reportedly wept with relief and gratitude, blessing their king for finally yielding. It was, in a real sense, the only true defeat Alexander ever suffered, and it came not at the hands of any enemy, but at the limits of his own men. Before leaving, he ordered the construction of a row of enormous altars to mark the farthest reach of his conquests, monuments to the place where the unstoppable conqueror had finally been stopped. The edge of the world would remain forever just beyond his grasp. But turning back did not mean simply retracing his steps, because Alexander was incapable of doing anything in a straightforward or modest fashion. Rather than march tamely home the way he had come, he decided to conquer his way down the entire length of the great river system to the southern sea, salvaging a version of his dream of reaching the ocean even as he abandoned the eastern one. He had an enormous fleet of boats constructed, loaded his army aboard and alongside, and began a long campaign down the river that would take many months and prove to be some of the harshest and most ruthless fighting of the whole expedition. He was, by all accounts, in a darker and more savage temper, after the humiliation of the mutiny, and the peoples who resisted his passage down the river paid a heavy price for it. The glorious liberator of the early years had hardened into something grimmer, a man determined to prove, perhaps to his soldiers and perhaps to himself, that he was still the irresistible force he had always been. It was during this river campaign that Alexander came closer to death than at any other moment in his entire life, and it happened because of the very quality that had made him a legend. Attacking the fortified town of a warlike people, he found his troops hesitating at the foot of the walls, their old eagerness dulled by exhaustion and resentment. Impatient and perhaps stung by their reluctance, Alexander seized a scaling ladder, climbed up onto the wall himself in full view of everyone, and then, in an act of breathtaking and frankly reckless boldness, leapt down alone into the enemy town on the far side of the wall, accompanied by only a tiny handful of companions. Surrounded by defenders fighting for his life, the king was struck by an arrow that pierced deep into his chest and lodged near his lung, and he went down. His soldiers, seeing their king disappear over the wall and then fall, were gripped by a frenzy of terror and devotion, swarming over the walls in a desperate frantic rescue, certain they were about to lose the man who was the heart and soul of the entire enterprise. They got him out alive, barely. The arrow was cut from his chest in a dangerous operation, and for days the army held its breath, not knowing whether their king would live or die, and a rumour that he was already dead began to spread through the camp, threatening to dissolve the whole army into panic. To stop it, the gravely wounded Alexander, as soon as he could manage it, had himself carried out and placed on a boat that drifted slowly past the assembled soldiers, where he weakly raised his hand to show them he was alive. The relief and joy that swept the army was overwhelming, men weeping and reaching out to touch him as he passed. He survived, but the wound was severe and never fully healed, and it almost certainly weakened him for the rest of his shortened life. It was the bill, finally coming due, for a lifetime of insisting on being the very first man into every danger. When the fleet at last reached the mouth of the great river and emerged onto the open southern sea, Alexander sailed out onto the waves, made sacrifices to the gods of the ocean, and marvelled at the strange and powerful tides, which astonished his Mediterranean soldiers, who came from a sea that barely has any. He had reached an ocean, even if it was not the one he had dreamed of standing beside. From here, the long journey back to the heart of his empire began in earnest, and Alexander, ever the explorer, divided it into multiple expeditions. He ordered his trusted admiral to take the fleet and sail westward along the entirely unknown coastline back toward the Persian Gulf, a pioneering voyage of exploration into waters no Greek had ever charted, which would see the sailors endure starvation, terrifying encounters with whales that spouted and breached around their small ships, and bewildering meetings with primitive coastal tribes who lived entirely on fish and apparently had never seen a proper ship before finally completing one of the great maritime achievements of the ancient world. The admiral kept careful records of everything he saw along that mysterious coast, and his account became a treasured source of geographic knowledge for generations, a reminder that Alexander's expedition was, among everything else, one of the largest voyages of discovery the ancient world ever mounted. A portion of the army was sent home by a relatively easy inland route, and Alexander himself naturally chose to lead a large part of his force across the single, most hostile stretch of terrain available, a vast and merciless desert. This decision produced the greatest catastrophe of his entire career, and unlike his defeats in argument, this one cost an enormous number of lives. Why he chose to march through that particular desert is still debated, with explanations ranging from a desire to support the coastal fleet from land, to an urge to succeed where an ancient legendary expedition had reportedly failed, to plain overconfidence. Whatever the reason, the desert was a furnace. The army staggered for weeks across burning sand under a punishing sun, with almost no water and dwindling food, men and animals dropping from heat and thirst in numbers no battle had ever matched. At one point, a sudden flash flood roared down a dry riverbed where the camp had settled, drowning many of the women, children, and camp followers who travelled with the army. The suffering was immense, and the column that finally emerged from the wasteland was a fraction of the size it had been going in, having lost far more people to the sand than to any human enemy. Yet even in that nightmare, the old Alexander, the leader who had once won hearts by sharing every hardship with his men, briefly reappeared. According to a famous and genuinely touching story, when a small group of his soldiers managed to find a little precious water and brought it to their parched king in a helmet, Alexander, looking at his thirsty men all around him who had none, refused to drink a single drop. Instead, he tipped the water out onto the sand in front of everyone, declaring that he would not drink while his soldiers went without. It was a small gesture in the face of overwhelming misery, but it reportedly revived the spirits of the whole exhausted column, reminding them why they had followed this man across the world in the first place. The capacity for that kind of leadership had never entirely left him, even buried beneath the paranoia and grandeur of his later years. When he finally reached the settled, civilized provinces again, Alexander found that his long absence in the unknown East and the persistent rumours of his death had encouraged a great deal of bad behaviour among the officials he had left in charge. Many governors and commanders, assuming the king would never return from the edge of the world, had grown corrupt, abusive, or openly disloyal, plundering their provinces and behaving as though they answered to no one. Alexander responded with a sweeping and merciless purge, removing and executing corrupt and treacherous officials across the empire in a wave of punishments that restored order but deepened the climate of fear surrounding his throne. The message was unmistakable. The king was back, and anyone who had taken liberties in his absence would answer for it. It was around this stage of the homeward journey that one of the most haunting episodes of the whole expedition took place, involving the Indian holy man who, as mentioned earlier, had attached himself to Alexander's travelling court out in the east. This aged sage, having fallen seriously ill and unwilling to live on as a diminished invalid, calmly announced that he intended to end his life in the manner of his own philosophy, by mounting a funeral pyre and letting the flames take him. Alexander tried to talk him out of it, but the old man was serene and unshakable, and so a great pyre was built, and before the assembled army he climbed onto it and lay down, without the slightest sign of fear or pain, as the fire was lit, never flinching or crying out, to the absolute astonishment of the watching Macedonians, who could scarcely comprehend such calm in the face of death. As he took his leave of the king, the sage reportedly told Alexander not a sad farewell, but a strangely casual one, saying that there was no need for goodbyes because they would meet again before long in Babylon. At the time it seemed a puzzling remark from a dying philosopher. Only later, when events unfolded as they did in that very city, would people look back on those words with a shiver and read them as an eerie prophecy. For a man who wanted nothing, the sage had managed a remarkably memorable exit, which is more than most of the men who wanted everything ever achieved. Then, at the old capital city, Alexander staged the grandest expression yet of the great vision that had increasingly defined his rule, the dream of fusing the conquerors and the conquered into a single united people. He arranged an enormous mass wedding, a spectacular multi-day celebration in which he and dozens of his highest-ranking officers all married noble Persian and Eastern brides in a single magnificent ceremony, while thousands of his ordinary soldiers who had already taken Eastern wives had their unions formally recognized and rewarded with generous gifts. Alexander himself married into the old Persian royal family, taking as a wife a daughter of the great king he had defeated, binding himself directly to the dynasty he had overthrown, and positioning any future children as heirs to both worlds at once. To complete the gesture of goodwill toward his army, he also announced that he would pay off the personal debts of every soldier in the entire force out of his own staggering treasury, an act of generosity so vast it almost defies imagination. The vision behind it all was genuinely remarkable, a deliberate attempt to weld two great civilizations into one through marriage, partnership, and shared rule. Whether his hard-bitten Macedonians shared the dream was another matter entirely, and the fact that many of them quietly abandoned their imposed Eastern wives the moment Alexander was no longer around to insist suggests the answer was, for the most part, a polite but firm no. That simmering Macedonian resentment of the king's pro-Persian policies finally boiled over into a second great mutiny in a town along the river. The trigger was Alexander's announcement that he intended to discharge his oldest and most worn-out Macedonian veterans, sending them home with honours and rewards. Far from being grateful, the soldiers exploded in anger and wounded pride, feeling that they were being cast aside and replaced, especially since Alexander had been steadily integrating Persians into his army, training tens of thousands of young Persians to fight in the Macedonian style, and even admitting them into the elite units that had once been the exclusive preserve of the Macedonian nobility. In a furious, mocking confrontation, the whole army essentially dared him to dismiss not just the veterans but all of them, sarcastically suggesting he could go off and conquer the world with his new foreign troops and his divine father for company, a pointed jab at his pretensions to godhood. Alexander's response was characteristically dramatic. Enraged, he leapt down among the mutinous soldiers, personally pointed out the ringleaders to be arrested, and then delivered a blistering speech recounting everything he and his father before him had done to raise the Macedonians from a poor rustic people into the masters of the world, listing his own wounds and sacrifices, and contemptuously inviting them all to go home and tell everyone they had abandoned their king. Then he stormed off, shut himself away, and refused to see any Macedonians at all, instead conspicuously beginning to hand out the prestigious commands and honours to Persians, organising his court and army around his new subjects as though the Macedonians no longer existed. It was a masterstroke of emotional manipulation, and it worked completely. After a few days of this, the Macedonians broke. Horrified at the thought of being cast off and replaced by the very people they had conquered, they crowded outside the king's quarters, throwing down their weapons, weeping and begging to be forgiven and taken back. Alexander emerged, and there was a tearful, emotional reconciliation, the king declaring that he regarded them all as his kinsmen and embracing them. He then held an enormous banquet of reconciliation, at which he offered prayers for harmony and partnership between Macedonians and Persians, before finally sending his veterans home with full honours and rewards under the command of a trusted general. The bond between the king and his men, frayed almost to breaking, had been dramatically mended one final time, and then came the blow from which, in many ways, Alexander never recovered. His closest and dearest companion since boyhood, the man who'd been described much earlier in this story as a second version of himself, his most trusted friend and his second in command, fell suddenly ill with a fever and within days died. The two of them had been inseparable for their entire lives, classmates in their youth, comrades through every campaign, and their friendship had been the one constant emotional anchor in Alexander's increasingly lonely existence at the summit of the world. The grief that consumed Alexander was overwhelming and almost frightening in its intensity. He reportedly threw himself on the body and would not be moved for a long time, refused all food and drink for days, and cut off his hair in mourning, in conscious imitation of the way his hero Achilles had grieved for his own beloved companion in the great poem Alexander had treasured since childhood. He ordered a period of extravagant mourning across the whole empire, planned a monstrously expensive funeral monument, and lashed out in his sorrow at those he blamed for failing to save his friend. The man who had conquered most of the known world was utterly broken by a single personal loss, and many who knew him believed he was never truly the same afterward, that some essential spark had gone out of him. It was a grief so profound that it seemed to drain away his own will to live, and it cast a long shadow over the final months of his life. Those final months unfolded back in the great ancient city he had chosen as the centre of his vast empire, where Alexander returned and began, despite his grief, to plan and dream on the enormous scale that came naturally to him. Embassies arrived from distant peoples across the known world, from many directions and many nations, all coming to acknowledge his greatness, seek his favour, or simply marvel at the man who now ruled from Greece to the edge of India. He was already planning his next great adventure, an expedition to conquer the lands of Arabia, and his restless mind teemed with grand schemes for exploration, construction, and the further knitting together of his empire. His wife was expecting a child. For all the darkness of his recent losses, the future still seemed to stretch out before him, full of new horizons to chase, as it always had. The plans he was reportedly turning over in those final months were staggering in their ambition. The dreams of a man who genuinely believed no goal was beyond him, including vast naval expeditions, the building of enormous temples and monuments, the founding of yet more cities, and the wholesale mixing of populations across his empire on a scale never before attempted. Whether even Alexander could have accomplished a fraction of it is impossible to know. What the sources also dwell on, with the benefit of hindsight, is a gathering cloud of unsettling omens that supposedly troubled his last weeks, strange incidents and warnings from his seers that something terrible was approaching, including a bizarre episode in which a stranger was found sitting silently on the royal throne, which the priests interpreted with great alarm. Ancient writers love to assemble these portents after the fact, and it is wise to take them with a healthy pinch of salt, since a dramatic death always seems to attract a tidy collection of warning signs that nobody apparently took seriously enough at the time. Still, the mood around the king in those final weeks was, by every account, growing heavy with a sense of foreboding, but it was not to be. After a long night of heavy drinking at a banquet, the kind of marathon feast the Macedonians had always loved, and that had already cost so much over the years, Alexander developed a fever. Over the following days, the illness steadily worsened, and the once tireless king grew weaker and weaker until he could no longer speak or rise from his bed. As the news spread that he was dying, his devoted soldiers, refusing to believe it and fearing they were being deceived, demanded to see him, and they were allowed to file past his bedside one by one in a long, silent procession, each man saying a final farewell to the leader who had carried them across the world, while the dying Alexander, unable to speak, could only acknowledge each of them with a faint movement of his eyes or his hand. It was a quiet, heartbreaking end to one of the most extraordinary partnerships between a commander and his men in all of history. In the early summer of the year 323 BC, Alexander died in that city, at the astonishingly young age of just 32. The cause of his death has never been established and remains a genuine mystery to this day. The leading explanations point to a natural illness such as malaria or typhoid fever, possibly aggravated by years of relentless campaigning, the lingering effects of his terrible chest wound, exhaustion, and heavy drinking. But from the very beginning there were also dark whispers of poison, suspicions that someone among his own circle, perhaps fearful of the increasingly unpredictable king, had arranged his end. Modern opinion tends to favour disease over assassination, but the truth was buried with him, and we will almost certainly never know for certain. There is, however, a grim and fitting irony in how he went. The man who had stood unflinching at the front of every battle, who had been wounded again and again and survived encounters that should have killed him a dozen times over, who never once lost a fight against any human enemy, was in the end brought down by an enemy that no spear or shield or brilliant tactic could defeat, dying in a bed rather than on a battlefield, undefeated to the last. He left behind one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, stretching across thousands of miles from the Greek homeland in the west to the river valleys of the east. But it was an empire held together by nothing more substantial than the sheer force of his own personality and prestige, and he had made the catastrophic oversight of leaving no clear plan for what should happen after he was gone. He had no grown heir ready to take the throne. His wife was carrying a child who had not yet been born, and his only other male relative was a half-brother who was widely regarded as incapable of ruling. When his closest companions, gathered around his deathbed, supposedly asked him to whom he left his empire, the dying king is said to have replied only that he left it to the strongest, which, whether he actually said it or not, turned out to be a tragically accurate prediction of the chaos to come. What followed was a long, bloody scramble for the pieces. His leading generals, the powerful and ambitious men who had commanded his armies and governed his provinces, almost immediately began carving up the empire among themselves, and then warring over the spoils for decades in a series of brutal conflicts. These successors, hard and capable men in their own right, founded their own dynasties and kingdoms out of the fragments of Alexander's realm, and in the ruthless power struggles that consumed the next generation, the entire royal family was wiped out. One of them established a long-lived dynasty ruling Egypt from the great city by the Nile, a line that would endure for nearly 3 centuries until its very last queen. Another seized the enormous eastern stretch of the empire, from Mesopotamia toward the borders of India, carving out a vast realm of his own. Others fought bitterly over Macedonia, Greece, and the lands in between, and the map of Alexander's conquests was redrawn again and again in blood over the following decades. Alexander's young son, born after his father's death and named after him, was eventually murdered along with his mother once they had outlived their usefulness as pawns, and the same fate befell the half-brother and even the formidable mother who had filled the conqueror with dreams of greatness from his earliest childhood. Within a single generation, the bloodline that had conquered the world was utterly extinguished, snuffed out by the very men who had served it. The empire built on one man's name did not, it turned out, long survive the loss of that name. Even the conqueror's body became the subject of a strange and lasting drama. Alexander was embalmed and placed in a magnificent coffin of gold, and as his funeral procession set out to carry him home to the ancestral burial grounds of the Macedonian kings, one of his most cunning generals, the one who had seized control of Egypt, intercepted the cortege and diverted the body to his own territory instead. He understood that possessing the remains of Alexander carried enormous prestige and legitimacy, and so the conqueror came to rest not in his homeland, but in the great Egyptian city Alexander himself had founded, where his tomb became one of the most famous shrines in the ancient world, visited and venerated by powerful rulers for centuries afterward. Later conquerors and emperors made pilgrimages to gaze upon the preserved body of the legend, and one famous Roman ruler, paying his respects, is said to have accidentally damaged the corpse's nose while reverently handling it, which is a wonderfully human little disaster, the ancient equivalent of breaking a priceless museum piece while leaning in for a better look. And then, at some point over the long centuries that followed, amid wars, disasters, and the slow erosion of time, the tomb was lost. Its exact location was forgotten, and despite endless searching and speculation right up to the present day, the final resting place of one of history's greatest figures has never been found. It remains one of the enduring unsolved mysteries of the world, a conqueror who claimed the earth, and yet whose grave the earth has swallowed and hidden away. Yet for all the violence and chaos that erupted the moment he died, Alexander's true legacy turned out to be something far more durable than any empire of swords and provinces. Though the political unity he had forged shattered within a few years, the cultural fusion he had set in motion took deep and permanent root. In the wake of his conquests, Greek language, art, philosophy, architecture, and ways of living spread across an immense swathe of the world, mingling with the ancient traditions of the East to produce a rich new blended civilization, the world we now call the Hellenistic Age. The successor kingdoms that rose from the wreckage of his empire became centres of this Greco-Eastern culture, and the great city he had founded at the mouth of the Nile blossomed into the intellectual capital of the entire ancient world, home to a legendary library and a community of scholars that preserved and advanced human knowledge for centuries. The mingling of peoples and ideas that Alexander had pursued, often clumsily and at great cost, ended up reshaping the cultural map of the world in ways that long outlived him. In time, of course, these Hellenistic kingdoms grew old and weak, and were swallowed one by a new and rising power in the West, the relentless and well-organized state of Rome, until the last of them finally fell. But even in conquering the Greek world, Rome absorbed its culture, adopting its art, its gods, its literature, and its ideas, and then carried that inheritance onward across its own vast empire, so that the cultural current Alexander had helped set flowing passed into the bloodstream of Roman civilization, and, through Rome, into the foundations of the Western world that followed. The young king from a small northern kingdom, who had set out chasing personal glory in the edge of the world, ended up changing the shape of human history far more profoundly through the culture his conquests spread than through the borders his armies drew. And so we come to the end of the road, for the boy who once tamed a black horse by understanding its fear, who slept with a poem of heroes beneath his pillow and dreamed of matching their deeds, who could not bear to come in second at anything, and so resolved to be first at everything. He got exactly the bargain his beloved Achilles had chosen long ago in the pages of that poem, a short life blazing with everlasting fame rather than a long and quiet one. He died at 32, undefeated on every field of battle, having built and lost an empire, fused two worlds, founded cities that still stand, and burned himself out like a comet across the sky of the ancient world. More than 2,000 years later, here we still are, telling his story in the dark. Whether you see him as a visionary genius, a brilliant and brutal conqueror, a tragic figure undone by his own boundless ambition, or some impossible mixture of all three, there is no denying that few human beings who have ever lived left a deeper mark on the world than the restless young man who threw a spear across the water and claimed a continent. And on that note, dear listeners, we reach the end of our long journey together, from a courtyard in a small kingdom to the lost tomb of the man who conquered the world. Thank you for travelling all these miles at my side tonight. Now it is time to let the torches gutter low and rest. Sleep well, sweet dreams, and good night.